This video is a prologue to In Memoria Adytum. It is divided into chapters, so feel free to skip to whatever part you like. As always, stay sane and let's delve in. SCP-2095 Kirok of Karcist Tundes. A Kirok is an organic, biologically living structure used as temples. The Foundation presently has a deceased instance in containment, but other, possibly living instances are theorized to exist across the world. Dr. Tsukino wrote in a report that the creation of a Kirok is more terrible than initially hypothesized. A living human is anointed, then repeatedly fed and shaped, its brains slowly atrophying as it becomes a living temple. The Sarkites cultivate flesh and bone as one might tend a bonsai tree. The SCP Foundation file of SCP-2095 shows little details. I will read through the file and will elaborate with the explanation later on. SCP-2095 is a primarily subterranean temple complex located at Gyaros, an arid and uninhabited Greek island in the Aegean Sea. Structure predates previously known archaeological sites on the island. Inscriptions found within have included Cretan hieroglyphs, Linear A, Hittite cuneiform, and a previously unknown writing system composed of spiral-shaped glyphs varying in complexity. SCP-2095 is composed of entirely biological material and is believed to have once been a living organism. Samples taken from SCP-2095 have revealed bone, chitin, muscle, adipose, and viscera. Radiocarbon dating has placed the subject's death at Cal 1200 to 1000 BCE, with soft tissue having undergone a form of embalmment. Chambers are connected together via tunnels which are structurally and cellularly similar to the inner lining of the human intestinal tract. Large sphincters appear to have served as doors and are permanently relaxed. These portals would have likely been able to open and close as needed pre-mortem. The largest room contains an altar composed of bone, a component of the SCP-2095 organism. Forensic evidence suggests that it was used in a sacrificial manner. It is believed possible that living sacrifices provided SCP-2095 with the nutrients necessary for its survival, and the floor itself shows signs of acidic corrosion. The base of the altar has been carved into an Ouroboros, believed to be a symbol of religious importance to the creators of SCP-2095. 29 scrolls were discovered within the northernmost chamber of SCP-2095. Only 4 were found to be written in Hittite cuneiform, while the rest remain undecipherable. Of those 4, 3 are considered to be of a spiritual/philosophical nature, while 1 appears to be an inventory report. The first scroll is written by Son Alku, and it reads: "The wound cut from the flesh of totality deep, it severed the line of future and past. Drawn to its ancient fester, gods swarmed as flies to a corpse. We waited within bloodless veins, faithful to that which we could not know, unable to imagine that we might become their greater. Here, we slept until our souls became flesh." The second scroll is heavily stained and is written by Son Vith. Paragraphs that could be extracted. "The swineherd prostrated himself before the Sorcerer King and asked, 'Great Sorcerer King and Ozirmach, heart of man and light of lights. I speak for the folk of the cold marsh. We fear the red lanterns that dance without harmony. Our spirit guides warn of ill omens.' And Ion did assure the man, 'I have gazed upon the faceless ones, servitors of his undulating vastness. Their chief is blind, castrated by our words and will. He sings songs of anarchy, but they will not come again. These terrible spirits do not deserve our love. Render unto them no sacrifice until the stars have aligned.'" The third scroll, written by Son Skull, it reads: "And to his flock, Ion thus spoke. Have stepped beyond the flow of dreams, stood before the old ones within their own desolate domain. I have endured their intolerable force, across countless eons. I have seen the infinite dead worlds, murdered death herself. I have read the entrails of our Creator, beheld eternity unfurled. Know that our paradise draws near, and with our own flesh shall we birth it." Foundation archaeologists have found evidence of warfare throughout the island. This has included skeletal remains depicting likely anomalous causes for death, such as implosion, internal combustion, disintegration, radiation poisoning, and fatal physical reconfiguration. The Foundation became aware of SCP-2095 after reports of a cathedral of bone being discovered by a team of Greek archaeologists who had been studying a large mound on the Isle of Gyaros. Class B amnestics were administered and the archaeologists were returned to the general population. SCP-2095 was easily secured and construction of Reliquary Site-26 was completed by September 1949. On May 24, 2014, an earthquake occurred in the Aegean Sea. Reliquary Site-26 was unharmed, as were the anomalous objects retained within since its construction. SCP-2095 did, however, suffer some structural damage, but proved to be a serendipitous event. A hitherto unknown sphincter, sealed and hidden through calcification, had ruptured open within the altar chamber. Exploration of the chamber led to the discovery of the body of a human male. Individual has shown no signs of decay, and although lacking a detectable heartbeat, EEG scans have revealed low-level brain activity. Research into the subject and its relationship with SCP-2095 is currently ongoing. Found inside was a single well-preserved scroll, strewn carelessly, and likely never meant to be contained within. Deduced to be a letter, it is believed to have been written by the ruling authority at SCP-2095 but had been unsent, possibly due to events directly referenced within. The document has been translated and is now accessible for viewing by Foundation personnel. It reads, Grand Karcist Ion. May this missive find you at Kythera, for it shall be my last. Our enemies have begun their assault on the island, but we have completed the rite of preservation. The temple will sleep and await resurrection by the children of Adytum. The fallen kingdoms and followers of Mekhanite have united against us, even as their nations crumble. Still, they have transmuted our every victory in the region to that of defeat, even as their own fates are sealed. The Bleeding Heart is our last stronghold in the Aegean Sea, but no doubt our eastern domain remains strong under your eternal gaze. The wounds sustained today will heal into the ages of ages. We are undying. Their victory here shall be hollow. Karcist Mexa has claimed their profane instruments and sails for Kythera as I write this. I vow that none are to leave this island alive. May their names be obliterated and their flesh consumed. We summon the Red Death. For the blood of heathens, we sacrifice ourselves. We will meet again in Adytum. I remain Karcist. While the Foundation report has details about recent events considering SCP-2095-M, to understand SCP-2095 we need knowledge outside the Foundation. The Alexandria Library has 2 scrolls relating to SCP-2095. The first is about SCP-2095 and the second about Karcist. SCP-2095 was a Kirok that served as the base of operations for Karcist at the Siege of Gyaros during the War of the Flesh. During the battle, SCP-2095 was killed by Mekhanite forces, eventually being buried over time by the earth. It is unknown when the person who would be transformed into the Kirok of Karcist was born, though it was certainly before 1200 BC. This individual was an adherent to the religion of Nalka, and was chosen to become a living temple known as a Kirok. The person was first anointed, before being fed substances and had flesh-shaping performed on them, their brain atrophying as they transformed into a colossal Kirok. It became the mobile base of operations for Karcist, who made his base at the Aegean island of Gyaros off the coast of Greece. During the Siege of Gyaros in the final years of the War of the Flesh, the Kirok of Tundas was killed during the bitter fighting on the island. Karcist soon after triggered the Minoan eruption, ending the Minoan civilization and causing the late Bronze Age collapse. It also tells us that Karcist is a Sarkite Karcist and former commander of the Kalmyktama Empire garrison at Gyaros off the coast of Greece. Though Tundas lost a battle with the Mekhanites at Gyaros, with Tunda's Kirok being put into preservation, he successfully managed to survive the battle by hibernating within a hidden chamber of his Kirok. Little to nothing is known of Tunda's early life, though he was born in the Sarkic-dominated Kalmyktama Empire. Tundes managed to reach the rank of Karcist, likely assuming the powers typical of one. He eventually became the commander of a Sarkic garrison on the Greek island of Gyaros during the War of the Flesh. The Mekhanite Empire and its allies eventually besieged the island of Gyaros in 1200 to 1000 BC, intent on giving the Sarkites another defeat. However, during the early hours of the battle, Tundes wrote to Grand Karcist Ion about the impending defeat that Gyaros would suffer, and that Karcist Mexa had the Mekhanites' profane instruments. Tundes had in his possession one amphora of the Red Death, which he intended on releasing upon the Mekhanite army to turn their victory into a Pyrrhic one. This letter was never sent. He underwent the rite of preservation, concealing his Kirok beneath the earth in a death-like state until resurrection by a Sarkite could be achieved. Likewise, Tundes hibernated in a hidden chamber in his Kirok until he would be awakened once a Sarkite reached him. His awakening would never occur for over 3,000 years, in which time the Kalmuktama Empire fell and separated into different cults across multiple continents. Though the SCP Foundation discovered Tundes' Kirok in the early 20th century, his chamber would remain hidden until an Aegean earthquake in May 2014 opened it. Tundes would be discovered alongside his unsent letter to Ion, though the Foundation detected low-level brain activity and no signs of decay. Currently, he remains in hibernation. The Mother Who Demands One's Toes. The Faithful Heretic. Karcist Halyna Ieva. Karcist Halyna Ieva is one of the Archons of Grand Karcist Ion. She fought countless battles in the name of the Grand Sarcomancer. She is regarded with contempt even across the Sarkic groups. There is no report in the SCP database of Leva. However, the Wanderer's Library has several scrolls mentioning her. This video will be a reading through these scrolls. The very beginning of the scroll, it gives us the titles of Karcist Halyna Ieva. They are The Scourge of Iron, The Mother Who Demands One's Toes, The Flesh That Ate, Subversion of Mechanical Expectations, and The Faithful Heretic. Then the scroll reads, Of all the sick playthings of the Archons, perhaps none can compare to the tragedy of Karcist Halyna Ieva, leader of Nalka who conquered what is now modern-day Iran. O great Jalakara, how mighty her hawkhost was! It was said that she herself commanded 70 score twisted creations of vile flesh. Loyal only to Ieva and the Grand Karcist himself, as she tore across Asia Minor from Miletus to Troy during the Great War of Flesh and Bronze. Mentioning Eva's name is taboo amongst the devout, who fear she will haunt them afterwards. O accursed one, why do you walk among us again? Next there is an illustration of a Greek artifact depicting Halyna Ieva. It is believed that they worshipped and feared her as Scylla, one of the two mythical beasts that impeded brother Odysseus' travels. The scroll tells us of her appearance and traits. It tells us that Ieva herself resembles a human woman of Middle Eastern descent, with raven black hair and dark skin. From the waist down, though, Ieva no longer resembles anything human in nature. Where her legs would be instead lies a writhing mass of tumorous blackened tentacles like the arms of an octopus. Such appendages are both prehensile and dexterous. As to be expected of a Karcist, Ieva is capable of powerful Lyhokoteke, the art of Sarkic flesh graft. Using it, she can cause rapid growth of any life she wishes. Her wounds close automatically. Her gaze instigates tumorous growth in the flesh of others. Her breath spreads infections. Perhaps most importantly, her voice can control her hawkhost, an army of mindless flesh beasts carved from the remains of her fallen enemies. Such a deadly combination of rapid infection and tumor growth in her enemies alongside her swarm of abominations makes survival slim for those who draw Eva's ire. Next, the scroll describes her march and battles. It reads, During her infamous death march across Asia Minor, Karcist Ieva proved herself to be a dauntless leader and fierce combatant. She led her horde from the front lines. She often spared none, taking the soldiers of her conquest into her hawkhost, after which they must pay a price of flesh. Such payments generally take the form of one's toe, making humans her particular choice of prey. The next scroll contains details about her history and origin. It reads, writings and artifacts dating to the late Bronze Age collapse have indicated that a Nalka woman led an army of raving fiends, toppling the ancient cities of Miletus and Troy in what is now modern-day Turkey. However, the army was stopped while attempting to cross the Dardanelles en route to Gallipoli. Devout followers of one ambushed her slow death march, hurling naphtha and firing weapons of the gods. In her attempt to press forward, Ieva's hawkhost was utterly torn apart. Her fleets of abominations sunken by war machines larger than the Rhodian Colossus, taking their Karcist with them. Ieva was declared lost, another casualty of the ongoing conflict. Witnesses report Ieva weaving a cocoon of flesh around herself, enveloping herself fully before she submerged into the waters. Attempts to prove she had died have proven unfruitful, namely due to the lack of anyone willing to go near her cocoon. Next paragraph shows us that Leva mutated her own followers to make them more capable in combat. It reads, Ieva's followers have had their feet or legs forcibly removed, typically by the Karcist herself, and were subsequently cursed by flesh magic with suitable replacements. Examples of replacement extremities have included human hands, large abnormally shaped tumors, fluid sacs capable of creating pseudopods, club-like osseous protuberances, tentacles, a single large human foot with all toes removed, and long braids of black hair which twist themselves into the shape of a human limb. The scroll then warns of approaching her. Seeing that Lady Ieva is supremely hostile, conflict is inevitable. We urge any and all fellow beings to seek shelter. Currently, Brother Ganymede is advocating for permission to use the ways as a means to escape, but the current consensus is that it poses too great of a risk to the library herself. Understand that we state this with a heavy heart, perhaps hearts, for we hate to lose our fellow book lovers. However, Ieva has not been shown to be of rational thought, and an entity that can force His Holiness Bumero into retreat cannot be allowed to tarnish these glorious halls. We therefore propose an alternative method of escape. Carry with you a small satchel with an assortment of toes. Due to Eva's love for such appendages, it acts as a bait for her abominations to go after while you flee for safety. Out of the several hundred entities that have used this tactic, even the rather sluggish Dawn that wants citrus has managed to escape her hawkhost. As of recently, Ieva has returned, bringing pestilence and disgust with every step. Currently, Hand and the Devout are working together to halt, or at least impede, her progress. Representing His Holiness Bumero, leader of the Broken Church, is Alabaster Stalsbeard, a thaumaturgist specializing in manipulating metal. Representing the Hand and all her branches is Ganymede, a lich who teaches magic to developing mages. With luck, we hope that we can convince the jailers and even the book burners to set aside their feuds with us to counter this indomitable foe, but only time will tell. The next scroll contains testimony of few who encountered her. The first testimony is of Alabaster Stalsbeard, representative of the Church of the Broken God. It reads, O Mekane, when these smited the Sarkics and halted their progress, how we hoped their conquests would end. Instead, this madwoman remained, aided by the despotic archons even the Sarkics condemned. A heretic to her kind, and a plague upon us all. Why could we not be done with her? Yet I pray that thee in thy broken state will bless us, giving us the conviction to hold her off and willpower to not vomit immediately. Next we find an excerpt from a Mekhanite soldier's journal, dated to the First War of the Flesh. It reads, And thus the abominable one descends on our neighbor Troy, civilians and soldiers alike running as fortress walls collapse, flesh beasts howling as naphtha is desperately hurled. Scores of abominations trample screaming children, clouds of malaise waft among survivors. O one, is this the end? The next article is an interview between a Nalka priestess and Sister Io. It reads, Oh, how we hate her! The accursed faithful heretic, she that embraced those cruel archons, she that let power blind her vision. Lord Ion himself could not contain her, she who let depravity define her actions. She who brought shame to the Nalka name. We are honorable warriors, aiming to purge the world of the injustices we suffered under the damnable Davites. Yet she herself enslaves others. How can we justify our glorious empire when such despotic inquisitors as her exist? Last testimony is the words of Karcist Halyna Leva herself. It reads, "One of the first things that children learn is equivalence. If a girl dares hurt someone, she gets punished. If a boy dares insult someone, he gets punishment. Toes, I believe, are the ultimate insult, something so infuriatingly useless, yet so priceless. After all, we are only born with a set amount of them. We reveal those who lack toes as we do who lack limbs, for the infirm are incapable of performing work at an ideal pace. Why, then, can I not exact my vengeance on those who have what I cannot? You who mock the toeless, understand that I will come and harvest thy appendages to exact equivalence. You cannot discriminate if no one is different." At the end of the scrolls we find a comment of doubts by a scholar of the Wanderer's Library. It reads, "The question remains, where does the truth end and the legend begin? It is impossible to determine whether her death march was so frightening due to her tactical genius and combative prowess or through sheer luck. She always appeared to strike when the opponents were most lax, causing some to suspect her combat abilities to have been artificially inflated by her Greek foes who were embarrassed by their losses. Furthermore, her current hawk-host is nowhere the size of the one described in legend, which means that she may not be as difficult to manage as the epics indicate. With that said, fighting her is sure to be a suicide mission, and as such we still advocate seeking safety until our joint forces can halt her progress." Finally, Ieva claims that her actions are led on from childhood abuse. But there are no records that show Ieva having ever been severely mistreated in this manner, save the typical slave treatment she endured under the diva. Whether this acts as a means to justify her conquest, or was covered up in a devout smear campaign, remains to be seen. Lovataar is one of the four clavigar of Sarkicism. She is often seen as Grand Karcist Ion's favorite concubine. She represents sex, love, eroticism, pleasure, motherhood, disease, and unrestrained reproduction. Her story is part of in Memoria Adytum series. Before we get into the Sarkic texts mentioning her, we need to take a look at what the SCP Foundation has to say about her. Karcist Lovataar is mentioned in the SCP-2191 file. We will explore SCP-2191 file in the first part of this video. You can skip to the next part, which discusses her Sarkic texts. SCP-2191 is a temple complex located within the dense Hoya forest of Romania. The first two floors of the structure hold a close resemblance to Eastern Orthodox monasteries commonly found in the region. This is suspected to have been a deliberate effort to disguise the true nature of SCP-2191. Thracian and Dacian architecture have both been discovered in the lower levels of the temple complex. And artifacts belonging to the Kukitini Tripilian culture have been recovered from the system of tunnels that makes up the lowest known portion of SCP-2191. The caverns of SCP-2191 are not thought to have formed naturally, and were likely constructed 4800 to 3000 BC. SCP-2191 is inhabited by a population of organisms classified as SCP-2191-1. Instances of SCP-2191-1 are considered genetically human but have undergone several significant, seemingly fatal mutations. SCP-2191-1 lacks all major internal organs with the exception of the lungs, heart, and brain stem. The outer epidermis lacks pigmentation and displays a condition resembling cracked porcelain, possibly related to Harlequin syndrome. Entities appear androgynous, lacking or having somehow removed secondary sex characteristics. Their regressed eyes are covered by a layer of skin, rendering them mostly blind but still able to react to light. Further deviations from baseline Homo sapiens include especially flat, upturned noses, and funnel-shaped ears, both considered related to their dependency on olfactory and auditory perception. SCP-2191-1 does not appear to communicate via language, the only sound produced being a persistent clicking of the tongue, speculated to be a form of echolocation. SCP-2191-1 do not readily appear to undergo senescence, and have not aged since containment. Further analysis has revealed an abnormally slow metabolism. SCP-2191-1 instances are not believed to be biologically immortal but have a significantly decreased rate of necrosis. SCP-2191-2 refers to a collective of vermiform organisms. These organisms vary in size, form, and purpose, and are accordingly classified as SCP-2191-2A, SCP-2191-2B, and SCP-2191-2C. Genetic analysis of SCP-2191-2 shows close relations with fellow subgroups, their most recent common ancestors being Homo sapiens. It has been speculated that SCP-2191-2 did not naturally evolve on their own, but their true origin remains unknown. SCP-2191-2A superficially resembles lamprey but whose internal structure more closely resembles leeches. Each SCP-2191-1 has a SCP-2191-2A instance within their abdomen, primarily located where the stomach, large and small intestines would exist. SCP-2191-2B are an infestation of vermiform organisms that live throughout the hollow walls of SCP-2191. SCP-2191 appears to have been constructed with a system of channels through which SCP-2191-2B travel. These thin, long organisms will enter SCP-2191-1 orifices, primarily via the mouth or rectum, but do not appear to cause harm or discomfort to their hosts. SCP-2191-2B are believed to redistribute nutrients throughout SCP-2191, extracted from any SCP-2191-1 which have recently been fed. SCP-2191-2C, like SCP-2191-2B, inhabit the interior architecture of SCP-2191. These tendril-like appendages are composed primarily of neurons and attached to SCP-2191-1 at the base of the spine while inactive. Only when attached to SCP-2191-2C do SCP-2191-1 display behavior resembling that of a sapient organism. SCP-2191-1 are considered inactive while connected to SCP-2191-2C. During an active state, SCP-2191-1 entities will leave SCP-2191 and aggressively hunt for living humans, ignoring non-human animals and deceased individuals. Active states do not occur simultaneously among SCP-2191-1, nor do they hunt as a pack, choosing to spread throughout the forest. A paralytic agent is employed to disable their prey, injected via venom-delivering barbs located in the lower carpals of both hands. When prey have been successfully incapacitated, SCP-2191-1 will open its mouth and widen its throat, unhinging its jaw in the process. SCP-2191-2A will then emerge from SCP-2191-1's interior cavity, initiating the feeding process by latching to the victim's neck via a toothed, funnel-like sucking mouth. SCP-2191-2A will first inject the body with digestive enzymes, liquidizing organ, muscle, and bone alike before consuming the resultant fluids. The process can last anywhere from 20 to 50 minutes, depending on the size of its prey. Although known to those living in the vicinity of the Hoya forest, SCP-2191 was not recognized by the Foundation as an anomaly until August 1916. After the unexplained disappearance of 244 members of the Austro-Hungarian First Army during the Battle of Transylvania. Due to the First World War, operations to contain the threat did not begin until early 1919. Without a source of food, SCP-2191-1 entities appeared to enter a dormant state as of December 1924. Several incidents, occurring between 1932 and 1977, would result in the discovery of SCP-2191-3. On 26 September 1932, in Greece, the Irissos earthquake devastated the Chalkidiki Peninsula and resulted in 491 reported casualties. 126 individuals were unaccounted for, but the event was ultimately deemed non-anomalous, a connection to SCP-2191 established years later. On December 26, 1939 in Turkey, the Erzincan earthquake resulted in the deaths of approximately 33,000 people. Locals report a great serpent rising from the ground at the onset of the earthquake. The Foundation begins to investigate the region. On November 10, 1940 in Romania, an earthquake struck Vrancia. Casualties were low. Civilians report vampire attacks in wake of the disaster. Media outlets publicly dismissing the claim as superstition. March 18, 1953 in Turkey, the Yenisgonen earthquake causes widespread damage, killing over 1,000 people. Several survivors report seeing the arm of an octopus rupture from the earth. Civilians report pale men attacking survivors in the night. Reports ceasing after approximately 1 month after the disaster. July 26, 1963, Macedonia. The Skopje earthquake kills over 1,000 people and renders 200,000 homeless. Approximately 500 would go missing in wake of the disaster. Reports of pale men in the night are common. On March 4, 1977, in Romania, the Vrancia earthquake killed over 1,500. However, only 800 bodies are accounted for. Reports of pale men and tendrils pulling victims beneath the ground. Panic spreads throughout the region. Foundation operatives are able to confirm a connection to SCP-2191. The SCP file now shows us a classified entry. When we are granted access, it reads: SCP-2191-3 is an organism whose core is located deep beneath SCP-2191. Its true size has proven difficult, if not entirely impossible to measure, but root-like appendages extend throughout an area of approximately 660,000 square kilometers. SCP-2191-3 secretes a highly corrosive substance which is employed in the creation of tunnels throughout the Balkan Peninsula. SCP-2191-3 is sapient and exerts control over SCP-2191-1 and SCP-2191-2 organisms via physical interaction with SCP-2191-2C and through the release of complex pheromones. SCP-2191-1 entities act as feeder drones for SCP-2191-3. It has since been discovered that civilians, native to several isolated villages in the vicinity of Hoya Forest, have actively provided human sacrifices to SCP-2191 as a means of minimizing seismic activity. We then have an audio log of an interview made with an elder of the Hoya Forest. Dr. Judith Lowe interviewing Draga Negrescu. Draga Negrescu is a village elder and midwife, 96 years of age, from a place that has been removed from the file. She has proven knowledgeable with regards to the folklore and traditions associated with SCP-2191 and claims to be a descendant of the Solomonari. The interview was conducted in Daco-Romanian. Dr. Judith Lowe asks her what can she tell us about the temple. Draga Negrescu answers that it is where the mother resides like a queen. She sends her faithful bees to collect nectar. Like good beekeepers, we help the hive flourish. As you now know, it is best for all that we be allowed to continue our sacred duty. The researcher then asks who is the mother. To which she reply, the mother was once a princess, the most beautiful daughter of the Blood Empress. The great Karcist, sorcerer king of Adytum, sought to conquer her, as he did the domain of the Blood Empress. He claimed her, as was his right, and she became his favored concubine. In time, she came to worship the great Karcist, just as we who hold to the old ways do. She begged to bear his children, and the great Karcist blessed her with his sacred seed. The mother swelled with joy and life. Here she was planted and here she grew. We, like the pale ones, must keep her fat and satisfied. The pales spew the nectar into her many mouths, and her brood suckles upon her teats, and grows strong. The mother and the land are now one. Her earthen womb swells and soon she will rupture. All around you is tinder for the gods. End log. The last addendum of the SCP files is a statement of the O5 Council. It reads: There are some who wish to believe that the Foundation has never, nor will ever, cater to the designs and desires of an anomalous entity. Foundation efforts to contain SCP-2191 are now thought to have inadvertently led to the deaths of approximately 40,000 over 45 years. The obvious choice would be to neutralize the threat. And we've tried. The number of civilian and Foundation casualties being well beyond acceptable numbers. In order to contain the larger threat, we must allow it to feed. We are aware of the offense caused by this procedure. This is not the first time, nor will it be the last, that the Foundation has been forced to commit a lesser evil in prevention of a greater. We do believe that, in the end, our current method is the most preferable with regards to both ethics and efficiency. We are fully aware that every sacrifice feeds SCP-2191-3, allowing it and its brood to thrive. But we are not about to sacrifice the entire Balkan Peninsula to neutralize that threat. Not yet. So, SCP-2191-3 likely bore the children of the Grand Sarcomancer Ion. She would then be buried under the earth, in an area which would later become the Balkan Peninsula, waiting for the right time to give birth to Ion's brood. SCP-2191-3 had remained under the earth till this very day. Losing her human form and becoming a massive subterranean organism with root-like appendages, whose core is located under a temple complex located within the dense Hoya forest of Romania. Lovataar needed human blood in order to keep herself and her offspring alive, which led to her deploying a nocturnal species of vampire-like predators to capture humans and drain them of their blood. Her bloodlust was also known to be extinguished by local proto-Sarkic cults via human sacrifices. It was predicted that at some point in the near future she would give birth to gods. If she didn't get regular blood, she would become violent and cause earthquakes with her root-like appendages, leading to massive devastation. The area of effect appeared to be at least 660,000 square kilometers, and put the entire Balkan Peninsula in danger. In the 20th century alone, over 40,000 people were known to have died due to this. Because of this, the SCP Foundation had decided to allow the sacrifices, believing it to be the lesser of two evils, despite knowing this helped Lovataar's, and in turn Ion's grand plan. In the next video we will discuss Karcist Lovataar origin, and events that ended her up to be SCP-2191-3. Stay sane, and beware the abyss. Karcist Lovataar is one of the four clavigars of Sarkicism. She is often seen as Grand Karcist Ion's favorite concubine. She represents sex, love, eroticism, pleasure, motherhood, disease, and unrestrained reproduction. Upon being impregnated with Ion's spawn, Lovataar burrowed into the earth of the Balkan Peninsula, metamorphosing into a gargantuan form, allowing her brood to gestate as she was attended to by her holocaust. Since her 1977 discovery by the SCP Foundation, she has been given the designation SCP-2191-3. We will discuss Karcist Lovataar origin and life according to sacred Sarkic texts. In the previous video we discussed SCP-2191 and its relation to Lovataar. I would recommend watching SCP-2191 first, link in the description. We will first read through the Sarkic texts of her, then later on we'll read a scroll about her in Alexandria Library that further explains her story. The first Sarkic text we have is within the Memoria Adytum Prologue. It's titled, Of Lovataar and the Throne. I will read it verbatim. I go to set the people free. The words of her Ngakamats, her beloved. They were spoken with such quiet determination, fueled by the raging inferno of his anger and backed by the unstoppable force of his will. When they had sat together, all those years ago, when they had talked and debated for days, she had known in her heart that he was right. Their debate had never been about who was right. If it had been that they had debated, she never would have joined him in the pursuit of his mad dream. No, she knew he had been right almost from the beginning. Rather, they had debated the means by which he could accomplish his vision. The Diva had been a blight upon the land. Their cruelty and sadism had been unsustainable from the start, and how quickly they had fallen stood testament to that sad truth. The reality was that in order for the land to flourish, for the people to survive, the Diva had to fall. Lovataar stood alone atop the battlement, overlooking the land that Ion had liberated, that he had freed. Wherever he walked, the land had burned with the fires of revolution, and the Davite legions had fallen. Whether by sword, by whisper, or by the sheer force of his will, he had marched the Halkastana across the lands of the Diva and returned it to the people. Now here, in the holy city of Adytum, Ion had brought the Halkastana to rest. Here, he would abide for a time. She knew that it would not be for forever, despite the sage's whispering of Kalmaktama, the Deathless. It wasn't part of the plan, it wasn't a part of the future that her and Gakamats had foreseen. A surge of impotent rage and sadness threatened to overwhelm her, and she reached out to rest her hand upon the warm surface of the parapet. The fortress palace quivered beneath her at her touch, somehow feeling the depth of her anguish as it rose up within her. She could feel its desire to comfort her, the great Leviathan at its heart reaching out to protect and serve. A soft sigh escaped her lips and she gently stroked the bulwark, whispering soothing words to calm the great Kiruk. I have made a video about Kiruk of Karcist Tundes. I will leave a link in description. Now back to the text. She sensed its love, the solid sense of purpose that rippled through its massive bulk as it returned once more to its slumber. She had been wool-gathering, and if the palace had sensed her anguish, then others might have as well. A voice whispered from the shadows that gathered near the entrance to her balcony. It told her it is not yet time to grieve, my lady. And Lovataar looked up to see Saarn step out to greet her. She smiled at the diminutive girl and she bowed her head in respect of the sadness she heard echoed there. Lovataar replied that she knew. There is a part of her that wishes she didn't know, that he hadn't shared that part of his vision with her. She stepped back from the edge and took a seat on the bench that the palace raised for her. Saarn settled to the ground beside the bench, folding her legs beneath her as she did so. The assassin replied, "You would not have believed. Not as you do. There is always a price to be paid, my lady. You know that as well as any of us." Lovataar wanted to disagree with the assassin. A flash of indignation at the insinuation was quickly dispelled as she caught the undertone of self-recrimination in the other woman's words. She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts, then sighed in response. She said, "Of course, you are right. There is always a price. I just wish that." Her words trailed off as she glanced back out across the rolling hills that surrounded the Leviathan. How could she speak of her selfishness to this woman? How could she express the joy she felt when sharing space with her and Gakamats, of sharing herself with him in a way that Saarn would never know? Lovataar continued, "You wish that there was a way for you to be with him, even when you remain and he must go forth to battle." Of course she knew. There was little that slipped past the observant little spy, and nothing that slipped past all her eyes and ears. It was her gift, to see all and to know more. She closed her eyes and simply nodded, trying in vain to hide the tears that threatened to fall. The assassin replied, "There is still time. The Mekhanites are only just now beginning to plant the seeds of doubt in the Crimeless, and they have yet to send envoys to Kemet. The people of that ancient land are slow to anger, but they will get there in the end." The assassin held out a slender hand, palm up, before curling it into a fist, and Lovataar shook her head. Then the assassin continued, "We are anathema to the followers of Mekhanite. Their hatred of the flesh is a hate I can understand. But it is the magic wielded by the followers of Ta that I think Ion fears the most. Lovataar shook her head and waved her hand in a dismissive gesture, to which the assassin replied, apologizing. You did not want to speak of politics, my lady? I'm sorry that I broke into your reverie with such. It was Lovataar's turn to shake her head, and she said, No, my friend. We each serve in the way that we are best suited. I would not begrudge you the way that service reveals itself. You sought to comfort me, and I appreciate that. She stretched and leaned back onto the bench and said, And you are right. There is still time. The next part of the text is a quote from the Solomonari Voxeron titled The Rise of Kalmaktama. It reads, And it came to pass in those days that there was peace upon the land. The host of the Ozurmak had taken much of the land of the Davites, and there were none to oppose them. Ion had taken for his seat the city of Adytum, and he dwelt there for a time in prosperity. It was then that a great sadness overwhelmed the Clavigar Lovataar, and she went to Ion, and she begged him for a boon. She said, Take not thy wrath out upon thine enemies. Stay thy hand and dismiss thy righteous fire, for that path leads to suffering and death. And Ion's heart was moved, for he looked upon Lovataar with great affection. He knelt before her and took her into his arms and whispered to her words of comfort. It was such that her heart was still, and though she wept still for the prophecy that was yet to be fulfilled, her resolve was strengthened. For it was in those days that she set about to craft a gift for her lord. For 30 days and 30 nights she labored in great agony, growing forth from her bosom a finely wrought seed of such exquisite beauty that all who gazed upon it marveled. It was then that the Kalmaktama celebrated the feast of Sukanta, as Ion had decreed it would fall upon the anniversary of his liberation of the people. It was on the 10th and final day of that great feast did Lovataar present the fruit of her labor to Ion. She had taken the crafting of her flesh and added to it decoration of the finest lapis lazuli from the kingdom of Kemet, and jade from far-away Omwa. Together with Saarn, she had crafted a soft pillow to adorn its surface, so that Ion would be at ease upon it, and had crafted it from their own raven locks, so that it would continue to live with their love. And Ion looked upon the gift, and his heart was moved again, for he knew what great cost Lovataar had borne in the crafting of such a gift. And he bade the celebrants of the great feast to be still, and he spoke to them of her love. It was then that he decreed that the seat would travel with him, wherever he should go, to always remind him that he led only by the love of those he would lead. That's the end of the first Sarkic text. It's a bit confusing, but the Alexandria Library entry of Lovataar gives us some insights. It reads, As Ion and his Clavigar began spreading their religion worldwide, they faced opposition from the Mekhanites, and soon a war started between the two factions. During the war, Lovataar, with assistance of Saarn, created out of her body a long shaft of bone, a divan and a footstool as gifts for Ion, and would become holy Sarkic artifacts. However, she was eventually defeated along with her fellow Sarkites after Ion was banished. Following the end of the war and the late Bronze Age collapse, Lovataar, Nadox and Saarn waited for Ion's return, but as years passed, Lovataar left, trying to find a way to be reunited with the Grand Karcist. The second Sarkic text is titled, Of Lovataar and Liberation. It's part of Act 3 of In Memoria Adytum. As the previous, I will read verbatim. It was market day in the city. The streets were bristling with locals and traveling merchants. Smells of cooking fish, baking bread, and the crush of humanity filled the air. She wrapped her robes tightly around her as she worked her way through the crowd, wary of her perceived vulnerability as a woman out alone in the market. She stopped by a stall selling shawls and other woven goods, when she noticed a man staring at her from several stalls away. When she made eye contact with him, he turned away to look at the goods on offer. Subtle, she thought. She selected a shawl and held its gentle blues up to the afternoon light. She could feel her observer moving further away, but never out of direct line of sight. She wondered what had caught his attention. She wore the cloaks to hide herself as best she could, but she knew attention from men was often forthcoming. especially when not welcome. There had been a time when she had cultivated such attention, reveled in the way she could manipulate men and women at the court just by a look or an opportune smile. But that had been long ago in another place. Another life. Now, she mostly wanted to be left alone. Men, especially in this new age, felt entitled to a woman's body in ways she despised. She set the shawl down and offered the vendor a handful of silver denarii for cloth. She slipped the shawl into her bag and moved down the line of stalls. There were 20 or 30 people between her and the admirer, but she felt his gaze on her back as she turned down another line of stalls. When an alley opened to her left, she ducked down and slipped between the stone buildings. She leapt onto a windowsill and climbed to the roof. She laid on the dusty roof tiles and glanced below to see the man in the cloak dash into the alleyway. His hood came down as he ran, and she saw the telltale gleam of bronze at his eye and neck. Mekhanite. She pulled herself away from the edge of the rooftop and turned over so she had her face to the sky, feeling the afternoon warmth seeping through her robes. She draped her arm over her eyes and let her thoughts drift off to another time centuries before, when she had left her family behind. He asked her where will she go. She told her brother and lover that she wants to see her homeland again. There is not much left, but the old magic still sings among the rocks. She shall abide there for a time. To which he replied that she will not stay there. Though it may have been the first place she opened her eyes to at her birth, it was never her home. She told him she'd go to her disciple and finish their work on the plan, laying the groundwork for any number of weapons her people could utilize in the coming months and years. She'd not wanted to leave him in that dark place, but she could not have stayed any longer. If she must mourn, she would do so in the sun and under the stars. She had very little purpose, other than waiting for the appointed time for the return. She was in Jerusalem to meet a certain person and had taken her time exploring the city. A city apparently crawling with Mekhanite paladins hunting for her. A trio of voices from below her in the alley brought her back to the present with a snap. One of the voices dominated the others, loudly shouting in Latin with a metallic twang to the pronunciation saying, "Spread out, my brothers. I saw her come into this alley and I know she's alone. Vulnerable." She told herself, vulnerable, how confident. She watched them separate, the dominant voice heading deeper into the alley on her side, while the other two rushed away down a side branch. Careful of where she cast a shadow, she crept along the rooftops of several adjoining stone buildings, always several steps behind her hunter. She thought back to her time before meeting the Ozirmach, and the conflict that came with the politics of court life in Adytum before their revolution. Century after century of violence, either physical or social. And always, she was seen as vulnerable. Because she was beautiful, because she was a woman, only the Ozirmach and Nadox had ever treated her as capable without factoring for the calculus of her gender. The Mekhanite was checking each building he came across, peering into windows briefly before moving on. He stopped in front of an open door, a small residence tucked beneath a larger one, with a small stone staircase headed down into the earth. He was sticking his head in to look around the space, and she took the opportunity to leap down behind him. She took several running steps, and just as he was turning to look in her direction, she pushed him into the open space. He fell forward, striking his head on a wooden table. She closed the door behind her and latched it. He was stirring, the telltale clicking of brass gears somewhere under the cloak. She stripped out of her robes to just a sleeveless shift she had been wearing underneath. She placed her foot on his back, between his shoulder blades, and pressed down. She bent down and pulled the cloak away from his back, bearing the bronze plates up his neck and across his shoulders. He started to push against the floor, fighting her weight pressed down on his back. She reached around his face, and with a nail slit a shallow cut along the bare skin under his eye. She backed off and watched as he fought, struggling into a seated position with his back against the wall. Fine tremors rippled along his body beyond his control, the wound on his face bled, and his breathing sped up. The tremors built in intensity until he had to hold his legs from visibly shaking. His voice wavered as he asked, "What did you do to me, witch?" She smiled as he attempted to stand for a few minutes and then gave up, falling back against the wall. He screamed that he cannot move, asking what has she done. To which she replied, "You Mekhanites are so fond of replacing parts of your bodies with brass and steel, but you still need flesh. I am familiar with the ways of flesh." She saw one of his eyes had been replaced with a red gem which partially lit up the dark basement hovel. There were plates of bronze bonded to his face, leaving only small strips of skin exposed. She had slit a thin line just below his natural eye but above the uppermost plate sitting. From the cuts small tendrils of flesh were protruding and gripping the bronze plating. She asked, "What do you want with me, man of bronze?" The soldier replied, "You are Lovataar, queen of the abominations." She laughed, saying, "I am not a queen of anything." He spit, saying, "High priestess then." "Which?" Lovataar replied, closer to truth. "What do you want from me?" To which the soldier answered, "Eradication. Burn out the rot at its root." She shook her head, grimacing. His limbs pulled tight, as if lashed to 4 horses. He gasped in pain, and sighed, "Why do you Mekhanite think so little of us?" He coughed. "You and your kind. You and your kind are abominations, unnatural." A trickle of blood flowed from his natural eye and mouth. Lovataar replied, "We are unnatural. You replace your skin and organs with metal and we are unnatural. Your God is all that is cancerous in this universe. And you are its creatures, its servants on earth. We have no God. We kill gods, you metal buffoon." She clenched her fist and tendrils exploded from every exposed patch of skin on the Mekhanite, wrapping themselves around his body. Each left bloody trails across the bronze plates, and the cloak as his limbs were brought in tight against his body. He whimpered as he slid into a supine position. Before she left, she draped a ragged blanket from one of the hovel's beds over his limp but breathing form. Lovataar donned the robes over her slip, pulled them tight against her body, and lifted the hood over her head. She wiped at the few droplets of blood that had marked her face and hands, then slipped down the length of the alley and away from the market. An hour later she found her way to the trades district near the city walls and entered a glass lantern maker's workshop. The last of the afternoon sun was beginning to set beneath the horizon behind her as she entered. An older man from the back of the workshop called out saying, "Sorry, miss. If you'll be wanting some custom work done, you'll have to come back in the morning." Lovataar replied, "I did not intend to buy a lantern from you, but I would if it would lead me to what I want." The man asked, "And what would that be?" She said, "I have heard that Jacob, son of Ephraim, works in this shop." The man answered, "He does. What do you need of him?" She continued, "Well, Jacob, I was hoping you would speak to me of the other realm, of the veil which separates the waking world from the gods and even the spirits of the dead." The man replied, "There is only one God, the Most High. But what makes you think that I would be the one to inform you?" She said, "I have heard of your knowledge of that art called Kabbalah, mapping the ethers and the face of God." The man confirmed, saying, "I have studied the texts." The Lovataar asked, "Have you heard the term, never meant?" He froze, his eyes wide. She continued, "Please, I ask because someone I love very much has become lost in its seas." His face softened, saying, "Then your loved one is almost certainly lost." She insisted, saying, "They are made of stern metal. Let us assume the experience would not have destroyed them. What would it take to pull them back to the waking world?" He began to speak and did not stop until many hours had passed, and the sun had long set. When she left, her tutor well paid and her curiosity sated, she returned to her rented room. She had not finished writing her letter to Nadox until the sun rose again in the morning. She woke with a start, even the light silk slip covering her body stifling in the summer heat. Lovataar stood from the bed and went to the intricate enameled shutters hanging over the bed. She tossed the shutters open and let the breeze from the Lycus River below flow into the room. The apartment was situated high in the noble district of the city, overlooking the river. Behind her, there was stirring in the bed. She leaned on the windowsill, letting the air flow through her slip and hair, cooling the sweat on her skin. She looked at the Byzantine noblemen in the bed, slowly waking from their joint mid-morning nap. One eye opened and looked toward her form, backlit from the summer sun. Vest Asilean Spartanos yawned and smiled at her. She wondered again why she was here. "Hello, my darling," he said. Lovataar replied, "Dear Vest, you look liable to fall back asleep and waste away the day." Is this what the noble court Vests do in the great Byzantine Empire? Sleep away during the daylight hours? Vest replied, "My duties are mostly diplomatic and bureaucratic, but it's not my sloth that keeps me to this bed, my dear. If you were not so energetic in our lovemaking, I might have spare energy. But, alas, I must reserve my strength to satisfy your passions." She smirked. "That you only barely do," she thought. She bent to the table below the windowsill and poured herself some wine from the dwindling carafe. He asked, "Will you pour me one as well, my love?" She had never claimed to love him. She loved very few, and certainly not someone so vapid as this. But he was pleasant to look at and pleasant to sleep next to, so she did not correct his misapprehension. She poured him the last of the wine in another goblet, and carried it to him in the bed. "He is no Ion," Lovataar said. "Asilean, you know I cannot stay forever. When will you introduce me to the chief of the palace? My family expects me back in another month, which means I should leave soon. You said he was your uncle, and that you could introduce me." Vest replied, "My uncle is the Karapalates, it's true. He is my mother's brother, and he is very fond of me, as he has no children of his own. And I will, Serena. I keep my promises." She scoffed, and turned back to the window. The white walls of the luxurious apartment were cleaned daily by servants, who brought the Vest his wine and food while he was at home. Vest continued, "Don't be mad, my sweet. And don't go running off, back to the darker alleyways of Paris, stay here with me." She shook her head without turning back to him. Paris. She had not seen Paris in nearly a century. She was just sick of this city, and its Christian oligarchical nonsense. Better to go back to Prague and see Nadox. This endless wandering was going to eat her alive. She had no home, just a series of luxurious apartments in European cities, men trying to bed her, and no purpose. She had told him that she was from Paris, that she came from a noble Frankish family, and that her name was Serena. He thought of her as some petulant child, no doubt. She looked to be 19 years old, as it did her well to let men underestimate her. "Serena, did you hear me?" Vest asked. She turned to look at him, saying, "Yes. I heard you. But what I heard was sweet nothings about my staying in this city and becoming your whore, while you failed to produce an introduction as promised." He stared at her, but she turned back to the river and drank more of the wine. Why had she ever let him think she was seduced? She was so bored. Why bother to couple with anyone who was not a Clavigar or Ion? She grinned when she thought that the only other person with her perspective on time outside of her extended family was Bumero, but then, he would not find that so funny. His hands found her bare shoulders and his lips found her neck. He cooed at her like a lost puppy, as he turned her face to his for a kiss. She let him. "I could eat you alive. And yet, because I am a woman, you treat me as your property already owned." Vest whispered to Lovataar, "I do not want you to be my whore. I love you. Be my wife. Think of the prestige your family would earn. And think of the trading contracts for your father. Besides, I would provide for your every desire." God's blood, but he likes to hear himself talk. Then she replied, "Convince me, Asilean. Introduce me to your uncle and show me you actually have the connections you have promised for a week." He replied, "Tomorrow, there's a function at the palace, I can introduce you then. I was going to invite you anyway." She turned and smiled at him, willing the annoyance to leave her face, and thanked him. He patted the bed and she walked over, leaned over him and whispered in his ear, "Food." He laughed and rang the bell for his servants. The palace of Blitcherny was crowded with Emperor Theodore Lascaris' supplicants and family. Lascaris was first emperor of this new state, Nicaea, but for all intents and purposes it was Byzantium. Lovataar had been here centuries before, and the pomp, the affluence, the blind arrogance was the same. Much like her home in Adytum, before the Ozirmak came. Brilliant opulence almost completely unfettered by any limitations. Asalayan took her arm, wrapping it around his own, and insisted on introducing her to 3 or 4 functionaries before finally taking her to the refreshments. He said to her, "My uncle is hosting a series of visitors. We just need to wait a little while." She nodded absent-mindedly as she took a goblet of wine from his outstretched hand. At least the wine and food at such functions were usually superb. But then, thoughts of the celebrations upon the establishment of an Adytum free of diva rule brought up memories unwelcome. Ion had been gone for nearly 1,500 years, and she had left Nadox only a century later. Except for the occasional letters sent his way, she had only spoken with him twice in that span of time. He was busy with his machinations and the revolution of his flesh, but she wondered if he missed her. She certainly missed him. And of course Ion. But what she missed most was purpose. She had come to Constantinople for one reason, to establish inroads for her brother's agents, such that trade and supplies could be ensured for the scattered tribe of the Nauka. If the plan was to continue to unfold, she was sure support from an imperial power would be beneficial. She'd not informed Nadox or her disciple of this plan. It was born out of frustration. So much time, so little purpose. Her great work was already accomplished, and yet not completed until all the moving parts came together. Asalayan interrupted her thoughts, saying, "A duty to wait." Asalayan touched the small of her back. She looked at him and smiled. He breezed her around the palace banquet halls, introducing her to dozens of petitioners of various noble stations. She remembered very few of the names, as she guessed Asalayan was showing her off. A woman as property. A concept that was still so alien to her, being raised as a diva and then in the freed Adytum. She hated this new world. Even if she did not need Ion back by her side, she would have waited for the plan if only to reset society back to equal footing for all individuals no matter what gender they identified with. Asalayan said, "My uncle is ready for us. That's his manservant over there." She nodded, following him away from the gathering and into an antechamber with a very well-dressed older man surrounded by retinue. The older man took her hand in his and kissed it. Then said, "Ah, so this is the lovely Serena my nephew has been telling me about." Lovataar replied, "I'm pleased to meet you, my lord." To which he replied, "And I you, Lady Clavigar." She froze, his hand still gripping hers tightly. She pulled her hand from his and turned away just in time to see Asalayan darting from the room. Betrayed, made a fool of. Damn him. She turned, her nails extending and the veins in her arms bulging as her system flooded with adrenaline, her will asserting control over the flesh. The uncle interrupted her, saying, "Now, Lovataar, none of that." Vents opened in the floor in a rough square formation around her and flames as tall as she rose from the openings. He continued, "I would like to speak to you before the Holy Inquisitors come for you, but first," the older man looked to his side and nodded to a subordinate. She felt the floor give way and she was suddenly in a cage too narrow for her to lay down in. The metal was hot from the flames and scalded her skin. She cried out as the topmost layer of skin burned in parallel to the bars. The cage was lowered and then pulled horizontally until placed over a shaft before being dropped like a stone. As resilient as she was, she still lost consciousness at the impact. 2 weeks they had interrogated her, caged in a heated cell such that her skin blackened and crisped but never such that she would die. Any normal person would have perished after the first day of this Mekhanite torture, but she was Clavigar. What mattered was that her host promised Bumura's inquisitors would arrive any day and begin their trial. All because she was an abomination. She grabbed the bars of her cell and pulled with all her might, but the heat burnt the palms of her hands and forced her to release her grip. She was weak from lack of sleep and minimal food. Her Hawkost's regeneration prevented her body from taking too much damage, but as the burning was constant, she could feel her strength waning. She drifted, not asleep but not fully awake until she heard a clanging metal sound and the metal started to cool. She looked up and saw the guard with 2 individuals staring at her, the cage door open. The guard whose halberd pointed at her chest, he said, "My master bids you be careful, she is not to be underestimated." The 2 individuals looked modified, with brass and steel parts covering much of their bodies. One of them had a bronze grill instead of a mouth. His voice was metallic and distorted. The other man yelled, "Know your place, guard. Do not speak down to the chosen. Now bind her." The guard pressed the halberd lightly against her chest, just enough so that the heated point burned her breast through her ragged robes. Distracted as she was by the searing pain, she barely felt the manacles shut around her wrists and ankles. She was roughly pulled to her feet and half dragged out of the cell. The 2 inquisitors glared down at her as she was hauled into another cell and bound to a torture device. Her arms were bound to iron manacles held above her head, her back arched on a rounded drum of some sort, and her ankles bound again, but spread such that she could not quite find her purchase. The inquisitors glowered at her from across the room for several minutes as they spoke softly to one another. Then one of them stooped over her as the other circled behind the device. The one in front of her spoke, "You will tell us where your fellow Clavigars domicile, and you will tell us quickly, which..." She could feel the spittle from his mouth as he growled the words. The one with the grill instead of a mouth stood slightly behind the machine and began to circle to the mechanical apparatus stationed on her right side. As he passed, she extended her fingers as far as they could go and forced her ailing body to grow her nails. She almost missed him, but she felt the nail on her index finger glance off the bronze armor bonded over his loins. She could feel the flesh underneath the armor, pulsing with blood. He started to back away, but she pushed with all her might. Dislocating the wrist in the process, she plunged first 1 nail, and then 3, through the armor and dug into the space behind his manhood. He gasped, bending over. The other looked up in alarm but was too late to do anything as she absorbed the grill-mouthed inquisitor's flesh into her being and felt the strength returning, the burns closing. The inquisitor that had bent over her pulled a short sword, but she had already ripped her way loose from the manacles. Lovataar sank fingers into his eyes to the knuckles. She felt his brains leak out as she withdrew her nails. Both inquisitors sunk to the floor, dead or dying. She ripped the manacles around her ankles free from the torture device and pulled her robes across her healing body. Lovataar strode from the torture chamber on bare feet, the manacles clanging against stone with every step. Guards fell once they were within a stone's throw of her, as her Hawkhost began producing one virulent plague after another. If they were enhanced Mekhanites, she slipped within their guards to cut out their hearts, punching through armor and cloth like it was paper. She had taken daggers from 2 of the guards and had to defend against a few feeble attacks, but they were flesh under their modifications. She walked out of the prison's front entrance and saw the man who had captured her trying to saddle a horse, casting panicked glances back towards her. She let one of the daggers fly, puncturing his left thigh. He shrieked as she bent over his shuddering body. She said in cold eyes, "If I had the time or the inclination, I would have liked to set you on fire, my host. Let the last fiery moments of your life be a willing testament to the lack of respect you showed a Clavigar." She pulled the knife from his thigh and he screamed. Then she continued, "But I do not have the time, so take my gift. The gift of eternal life, from one who served at the right hand of the Ozirmach. You do not deserve it, and I hope it gives you much pain." She walked down the dirt road along the front of the prison. His screams intensified behind her as his body expanded and contorted to allow for the added mass and new tissues. Before she had walked to the end of the road and turned a corner around the walls of the prison, he had begun tearing up chunks of the street and buildings with his great red paws. Protrusions caught fleeing guards and prisoners alike and pulled them into his maw. She could still hear their cries as she made her way to the city gate. She left Constantinople that very moment, bedraggled and dressed in rags once meant to impress the imperial family. And yet, despite the pain she had endured, Lovataar smiled. Lucian, once Kalakaran, placed a bowl in front of her. She sat at the head of a large dining table in his opulent manner. He sat adjacent to her on the right. He said to her, "I hope you like it. I tried my best to recreate Clerget." She dipped the spoon into the broth and brought it to her lips. She smiled. "Yes, it is very close. Thank you." The soup had a similarity to borscht but with a coppery aftertaste, no doubt due to the inclusion of blood when making the stock. There were other subtle differences to the original dish, but she was touched by his attempt to make her feel welcome. He sipped at his wine and took some small spoonfuls of the broth into his mouth. He dabbed his lips and spoke again, saying, "It's been almost 10 years since I saw you last. What have you been doing, master?" She picked up the glass of wine in front of her and raised it to him in a silent toast. He did the same. It was rich, sweet, and complicated, like her feelings being in his company again. Lovataar answered, "I have been wandering mostly, studying some of the occult, experimenting with some of the outlying Nalka communities, and experiencing the world. I even went to America for a short while." He replied, "Ah, America, they seem rather brash there." She laughed, saying, "They are. But they're young. Also troubling." "How so?" the man asked. She answered, "There are men there organizing, in partnership with those in England, who would study the occult. And if they discover something, they lock it away, hide it from the normal humans. I think they could be trouble for our people eventually." The man exclaimed, saying, "From an ocean away." Lovataar continued, "Do not forget the Darkwater Lodge and Natal family are effectively in Louisiana, not an ocean away. Besides, the world is smaller than it was a month at sea and one can cross the Atlantic. We had best keep an eye on this American Secure Containment Initiative." The man agreed, saying, "I'll pass the word along. I'm sure the others will have made note. But I apologize if this is too forward of me. You seem unwell." Lovataar replied, "Are you saying I look tired, Lucian?" She looked at him from the corner of her eye as she sipped more of the broth. He laughed, saying, "No, that is not what I meant. You look stunning as always. I mean to say, you seem not yourself." She asked, "And what is this self I do not seem like?" Lucian replied, driven, passionate, a leader. She raised her voice slightly, saying, "Who am I to lead? Where is my army? Where is my part of the plan? Ah, yes, it is fulfilled. I merely wait. More than 2,000 years I have been waiting." Lucian interrupted her, saying, "Ion surely knew." She continued, "Oh, certainly they knew how long they would be absent. And I think Nadox knew. But all I was aware of was it would be a long time. Waiting for more than 20 centuries is quite long enough, don't you think?" She tossed the spoon into the bowl with a splash. Lucian tried to calm her. She continued, "No, Lucian, listen. Do not adopt this modern man's worldview of women with me. I was a diva and then I was clavigar, long before the Christ was born. We have watched Rome and Byzantium and a dozen other empires crumble. If you speak to me as women are spoken to in polite society, I will take your tongue." He was silent for a time and then got up to retrieve the bottle of wine from the mantel. He poured her another glass as he spoke and apologized. Lovataar replied, "No, I should apologize. I hate the way society has shaped its view of my sex. I have wandered this modern society watching each wave of modernity improve the technical aspects of life and barely touch the social. To know that every handsome cab driver that sneers at me or is a touch too lecherous, I could end in the space of a breath. It's not enough to have power, if society treats you like you do not. Lucian replied, You seem lost, my lady. She asked, What am I here for? Just to wait for Ion. I want to be doing something worthwhile. Lucian said, trying to change the conversation, Well, even if the great plan did not factor in for your necessity, I could certainly use your guidance. She asked, About what? Lucian explained, Love for one. But the work as well. Lovataar answered, Love, what do I know about love? The loves of my life are spread around the globe and beyond. I have not seen them for hundreds of years. Saarn is the only one that checks in on me. Auroch is buried under his temple, and Nadox has imprisoned himself in his cloister. Me, I wander. Love is a wistful memory, Lucian. I have obligations. He looked uncomfortable, then apologized again. Lovataar continued, I will wait for the appointed time. I will act when it is my time to act, but despair is my constant companion. All I can hope is that when the Ozurmak returns, they have some purpose for my life. For I have failed in finding one of my own. Then, let us talk about the work. They spoke deep into the night about the work he was doing with the carrier organism they had created so long ago. They had made a disease so devastating that it could wipe out most of the world in months. But Lucian had ideas to use the work as a basis for other things, intoxicants, the basis of stem growth in Nalka soldiers, and the foundation of whole new forms of life. Before he went off to bed, he warned her that she had caused a stir in the manner of her travel. Forces watched him, even if they could not do anything about it. He was afraid the fire of this attention would burn her as well. She reassured him, she had been burned many times before and had grown calluses. She sat by a fire in his manor's library with some brandy and an open book, but she wasn't reading. Lovataar stared at the crackling fire and sipped at the brandy. She wore a man's riding pants and blouse tucked in, but she had cast aside her boots and riding jacket. Suddenly, one of Lucian's servants burst into the room panting, Where is Mr. Dutoit, madam? In his bedroom, she believed. But he was already gone, racing up the stairs. She shook her head at his rudeness and sipped more brandy. A moment later she heard the pounding of someone descending the same stairs rapidly. Lucian approached her in his bedclothes and dressing gown. He said, We have company? We need to leave this place. She asked, What is it? Lucian shouted, Mechanites. An entire squad of them. Surrounding the villa. Lovataar asked, And were these the forces watching you, Lucian, or the ones that were following me? Lucian inquired. She continued, Oh yes, at least since Paris. I thought they would spring a trap on the road, but then I made it to your manor without incident. Lucian replied, Possibly they were intimidated by you. She said, It never stopped their lunacy before. I told you about Constantinople, yes? He nodded, saying, Well, come then, let's get you out of here. She pulled her boots on and picked up her riding jacket. Asked him to lead the way. He ran back to his room, pulled on some clothes while she waited, and then she followed him through a series of hidden panels in the walls. He led her down a hallway that led to the stables, reaching for a door when the wall of the manor caved in. He tried to leap back, but a metal gauntlet fist struck him in the right temple, sending him to the floor. Lovataar kept her grip on Lucian's forearm as he fell, twisting so she forcibly dragged his unconscious form away from the melee. She bent to pick up Lucian's dagger and turned towards their attacker. She was nearly 8 feet tall, covered head to toe in hardened armor plating. Even the space for her eyes was crisscrossed with mesh. The plates sat on top of one another, slightly offset, so each step or movement created these quiet, slipping sounds as well-oiled plates moved against one another. When her voice came, It was cavernous and metallic with an underlying lyrical tone that made Lovataar think the woman had once had a beautiful singing voice. The voice said, "My coterie will not interfere. The perimeter is being maintained, but you are mine, Clavigar." Lovataar stripped out of the riding jacket and held the knife towards her assailant. The voice continued, "You have nothing to say, which?" Lovataar replied, "Talking with you zealots is always a waste of my time. Say your piece and then I'll kill you." The towering woman laughed. It was a very unpleasant sound with so much of her inner workings being converted to machinery. The woman asked, "Are you so sure you'll kill me?" Lovataar shouted, "Enough posturing, you plate-mailed idiot." Lovataar lunged, driving the dagger into one of the mesh-covered eye holes in the woman's armor. The mesh caught the blade and prevented it from penetrating more than a finger's width. The Mekhanite reached up, grabbed the wrist holding the blade, and wrenched it away from her face. Lovataar felt the bone snap in the forearm the giant had grasped. She gasped in pain as the Mekhanite dropped her onto the floor. The woman then said, "So confident and yet you attack with a knife? Look at me, you abomination. You thought a dagger would suffice." Lovataar stood, bracing herself against the wall, and then passed the blade to her good hand. She was amazed she hadn't lost it. The bone in her right arm was setting and fusing, the muscle rippling under the skin. It was extremely painful. The giant Mekhanite extended a shimmering steel blade from the back of her gauntlet right hand. At its full length, the blade was equivalent to a gladius. The giantess held her feet wide and beckoned the Clavigar forward. The muscles along Lovataar's arms, legs and back bulged, adding mass. Her riding pants strained, the seams split along her thighs. She approached the Mekhanite carefully and feinted with the knife. The giant parried with the wrist gladius, but instead of backing away, Lovataar plunged forward and gripped the right forearm of her assailant. She pivoted, heaved and added her strength to the giant's momentum, causing her to stumble into the corridor wall. The Mekhanite's shimmering blade sunk into the plaster, blackened from the heat coming off the weapon. The giant howled and ripped her sword from the plaster, showering the unconscious Lucien and Lovataar with debris. She leveled the blade at Lovataar, and it burst from her wrist with the force of a gun. The Clavigar did not have the time to dodge, so she twisted such that the blade struck her in the right shoulder. She screamed as the blade plunged into her flesh, cutting tendons and shattering bones. She dropped the knife and grasped the blade, gripping the cable that trailed from the weapon to the giant's wrist. The Mekhanite tried to reel the weapon back to herself, but Lovataar held it firm, ignoring the burning crackling sensation. The giant growled and whipped her arm, yanking the blade free of Lovataar and reeling it back in. The cable slid into some unseen cavity in her gargantuan arm as the weapon locked into place. The Mekhanite then said, "Now, I will say my piece. You have haunted our order since the war, making no effort to hide yourself in your wanderings, poisoning the world with your flesh magics. I will take your life. I will not prolong this experience, but I cannot wait." The Mekhanite interrupted her rant with a visceral scream reverberating out of her metal throat. Lovataar stood, her left hand over the wound in her right shoulder, feeling the bones and cartilage reconnect. The wound still bled, the burnt flesh resisted knitting together, but she barely paid heed to the discomfort. The Mekhanite was on her knees, clutching at her right arm. The banded metal plates that covered her arm bulged first at the wrist, and then continued up to her shoulder. The banding bent and split, pushed open by the roiling flesh of the arm. "What is this?" the giantess growled. "The end of you," Lovataar replied. The armor plating had almost entirely separated from the Mekhanite's arm. The flesh expanded and rippled, extruding tendrils to several dozen points on her body. The tendrils ripped at the armor plating, causing various shallow wounds across her form. Finally, the bulging bands around her shoulder and down into her chest burst open, spraying Lovataar with the Mekhanite's blood. The giantess shuddered and slumped down onto the floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Lovataar bent over the form and said, "If you survive this, remember that you labeled us abominations. I will gladly paint myself in your blood to lay claim to the title." She walked back to Lucian and picked him up with her good arm, turning to the gaping hole in the wall that led to the stables. She put her disciple over a horse and tied the reins to her own mount. She cinched her riding jacket close against the cold and urged the horse forward. They only encountered one Mekhanite leaving the property. The man took one wide-eyed look at Lovataar covered in the giant's blood and turned away without offering resistance. She continued on for several miles, and once she was sure they were not followed, rented a room at an inn in the city. In the night, as she watched over the closest thing she had to a child, praying that he would wake, a grim thought took hold in her mind. "I will fulfill my obligation. I will return Ion to the waking world. But I will no longer be a catspaw. Ion shall grant me the purpose I crave in reshaping this world, or if he does not, I will plot my own course." That's the end of the Sarkic text. To make things more clear, we reached for the Keeper of the Lore in Alexandria Library. He had this to say of Lovataar. Unlike most Sarkites, she was originally the most beautiful daughter of a powerful Diva matriarch, named the Blood Empress, and thus opposed to the Grand Karcist and his cause. Her hatred for the Grand Karcist eventually became a sort of infatuation, and she wanted to capture, bind and turn him into her personal consort. She sent countless slave hunters to capture Ion, but none returned. Some time later the Grand Karcist himself came to her, meeting Lovataar in the bedchamber. But instead of attacking her, he spoke quietly to her. What about is not known, as legend claims that his words were only meant for her, thus never recorded. Over the next 12 days the two formed a union of sorts, and Lovataar became the Grand Karcist's favorite concubine. Fellow Clavigar, Orok, was at first distrustful of her, but after seeing her sincerity he came to accept her. Lovataar would also take under her wing Karcist Lucien Dutoit. As Ion and his Clavigar began spreading their religion worldwide, they faced opposition from the Mekhanites, and soon a war started between the two factions. During the war, Lovataar, with assistance of Saarn, created out of her body a long shaft of bone, a divan and a footstool as gifts for Ion, and would become holy Sarkic artifacts. However, she was eventually defeated along with her fellow Sarkites after Ion was banished. Following the end of the war and the late Bronze Age collapse, Lovataar, Nadox and Saarn waited for Ion's return, but as years passed, Lovataar left, trying to find a way to be reunited with the Grand Karcist. Around 205 C, Lovataar went to Jerusalem to find a Jewish mystic who possibly possessed knowledge about the dimension where Ion had been lost. While there, she was attacked by a group of Mekhanites, but made quick work of them, and proceeded to meet with the mystic known as Jacob and explained to her the nature of the Neverment. In 1271, Lovataar had arrived to Constantinople of the Byzantine Empire, where she took the identity of Serena from France and entered a false relationship with Vest's Asilean Spartanos, hoping to establish a trading agreement with the ruling families in order to take care of the scattered Sarkites. However, when Asilean introduced her to his uncle, who was a Chiropolates, it was soon revealed to have been a setup, and they imprisoned Lovataar inside a cage hovering over flames. Fortunately for her, when the Mekhanite inquisitors arrived to torture her, she absorbed the flesh of one of them to regain her strength before killing most of them, except for one whom she transformed into an immortal monster. In 1851, Lovataar began living within Lucian's villa in Portugal, but during her stay they were attacked by a number of Mekhanites. Lovataar confronted the leader, a heavily modified enormous Mekhanite woman who attempted to end the Clavigar for good, only for her to be killed by her. Lovataar and Lucian fled and continued their work in the reemergence of their religion. Lovataar then would beg Ion to bear his children, which he granted and impregnated her. Filled with joy, she would then be buried under the earth, in an area which would later become the Balkan Peninsula, waiting for the right time to give birth to Ion's brood. Lovataar had remained under the earth till this very day, losing her human form and becoming a massive subterranean organism with root-like appendages, whose core is located under a temple complex located within the dense Hoya forest of Romania. This form is currently known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-2191-3. Lovataar needed human blood in order to keep herself and her offspring alive, which led to her deploying a nocturnal species of vampire-like predators to capture humans and drain them of their blood. Her bloodlust was also known to be extinguished by local proto-Sarkic cults via human sacrifices. It was predicted that at some point in the near future she would give birth to gods. If she didn't get regular blood, she would become violent and cause earthquakes with her root-like appendages, leading to massive devastation. The area of effect appeared to be at least 660,000 square kilometers, and put the entire Balkan Peninsula in danger. In the 20th century alone, over 40,000 people were known to have died due to this. Because of this, the SCP Foundation had decided to allow the sacrifices, believing it to be the lesser of two evils, despite knowing this helped Lovataar's, and in turn Ion's grand plan. As Sarkicism began rising once again, with the adherents of the faith disposing of various heads of influential states and groups of interest, which was designated SCP-4273, Karcist Lucien Dutoit, Karcist Halyna Ieva, Karcist Yongsun Ban, and Numun broke inside the site containing SCP-3911-1, Lovataar's gift to Ion. They proceeded to use it as part of a summoning ritual. This ritual resulted in the manifestation of the four Clavigar before Ion himself manifested, having finally returned to Earth. Following the incident, the Sarkites began planning the next steps in their plan of taking down their enemies and taking over the world. Following the success of the cross-testing of anomalies at Site 100, SCP-2191 was cross-tested with SCP-4812-S. From this encounter, the vampiric SCP-2191-1 tried to steal the nutrients from the creature but were all killed due to SCP-4812-S properties. Lovataar then went on to engulf SCP-4812-S, but this also resulted in the being killing her unborn children. As a Clavigar, Lovataar was granted by Ion great power over flesh. She could give birth to various broods, became biologically immortal, and could shape his body to various extents. She grew to an immense size and rooted deep beneath the ground, where she would create various creatures such as vampiric humanoids designated SCP-2191-1, also known as SCP Type 003 organisms, and vermiform organisms designated SCP-2191-2 that varied in shape and purpose. The humanoids served to gather blood from their victims through SCP-2191-2A and feed Lovataar through SCP-2191-2B and SCP-2191-2C. If Lovataar was not fed, then she would cause earthquakes that could destroy various parts of Balkan Peninsula. Lovataar was often depicted as a beautiful and voluptuous woman. She was depicted as nude save for golden ornaments such as a headdress, necklaces and bangles, and possessing claw-like fingers and toes and a pair of horns which could be part of her headdress. As SCP-2191-3, she is described as a massive organism with root-like appendages extending to an area of approximately 660,000 square kilometers. As a priestess from the Diva Elite, she appeared to have been rather spoiled and arrogant, seeing Grand Karcist Ion as a threat to her very way of life. Despite this, after meeting him, he showed her the true nature of the gods and convinced her to join his cause, becoming a devout follower of Sarkicism. She, just like her fellow Clavigar, was extremely loyal to Ion, shared a deep bond between all five of them, and would do anything to execute every wish of Ion. She so dearly loved Ion that she even wanted to be impregnated by him and birth his children. There is a term among your people, Reekmata, heath honey. In early summer, when the azalea bushes bloom, they seem to blanket whole plateaus in vibrant pinks, creamy whites speckled with wine, sprays of peach flesh and buttermilk yellows and oranges like the heart of crucibles. It is a glorious sight, to ride to the uplands and behold them all, a bright ocean rising to the flanks of one's mount. And bending closer, one may glimpse the gloss of green leaves still peeping from between the blooms, and the fine threads of the stamens, and clambering among them many industrious bees, the clamor of whose drone is as the waves washing against the shore. But to take the honey they lay down in this time, gathered from this sudden glut of nectar, is dangerous. It bursts the heart, burns in the veins. For the first taste of it is sweet, and only grows bitter once swallowed. Some fear enough to eat no honey at all during this time, but most could not live with that avoidance, and so count the threat as acceptable. And so it is for people too. There are some who are poison, some who twist all relationships to serve themselves and themselves only, leech what they can and discard the remaining carcass when it is no longer satisfying. Of course, admitting to being heath honey would rather defeat the whole concept, and so you have never been called such aloud. But just because things are not spoken does not make them less true. More than one man has died in your bed, when your mother has requested it. The truth about her children can be hidden from no mother, and so she asks you to do nothing beyond what you would do already, with cause. She knows you are strong enough to cradle death against your chest. She knows you are charming enough that no one will ever suspect. The son of matriarch Yamajuda may or may not wish to be used as a bargaining piece against your sister Purazana, but his mother certainly thinks so, and will not be denied. Of course, it would not benefit Purazana any to be wed to him, nor your own house, nor indeed the two of them, for they cannot be allowed to think they hold more sway against your mother, sit higher in her favor than they in truth do. You do not speak of him at all, rather the horses, and the trade in jewels that has increased its output recently. A new silver mine to the west that should make its first export this year, but in the way your mother calls you by your names, Pelargia, Hellercator, and Purazana calls you Vaser, you understand completely. And so the next night, you paint your mouth and you smile at him at dinner, laugh and blink and lead him back to your own rooms. You ask to show him something, and you see in his eyes that he knows what you mean. Or at least, the meaning you had painted inside yourself for that very purpose, like the ochre on your lips. When the cassia tree had been planted beneath your window, the gardeners had not thought that it would grow. Its branches now weave up the wall, and you may step out onto them, one hand closing around the boughs so you do not fall, and the other trailing behind, to guide him. And then you are running on a memorized path, ducking underneath bushes and swerving around trees, clambering over the low dry stone wall that marks the edge of the estate proper, and down, where it drops off into a steep hill. Dry leaves crunch under your feet, and twigs grab at the hems of your skirts as you descend it hurriedly, taking pleasure only in the moving of your limbs until the canopy opens out, and the ground slowly rises to meet your steps, and you are finally slowed and stopped by the friction of the growing light ahead. He laughs, and you match it, quietly. Here, the river takes a wide, slow turn around a basalt shelf that overhangs the water, surrounded by lush mosses and ferns. The branches that are black slashes against the stars almost dip their heads into the flow, ensuring that anybody looking across from the other side is unlikely to notice you, especially on a moonless night such as this one. You guide his hands to your shoulders and hips. The ferns brush cold against your knees, thighs, and back. When you are through, he curls up next to you on the still warm ground, one hand flung over his head. You count your heartbeats in groups of 60 until you can be sure he has drowsed off, and then slip a hand inside your boot and pull out the small blade nestled against your ankle. The starlight washes out all the color from the bands of agate, but not the clamshell lines of the flakes fractured off. You frown down at his sleeping body, weighing the silence of his larynx against the speed of his intercostal space. But it is not a particularly quiet night. You hear someone yowling across the water within the lower city and myriads of buzzing cicadas that have resettled on every tree branch since you have disturbed them. So you move your fingers down over his ribs instead. You count 5, angle the biface, and drive with the heel of your hand. You shall see who attempts to pressure your mother after this. K. The wax is split, and the missive is read before you all, sisters and brothers gathered at your mother's table for the morning meal. The seal is that of Matriarch Tvizaratha, and the messenger also wore her colors. The word insurrection feels strange in your ears, flutters like copperfly wings over the lips of your brothers as they whisper to each other. Some strange intrigue brewing between the slaves in the cities and the peasants in the frontiers of her territory. Taxes are going unpaid, and when soldiers ride out to collect they come back to report villages empty, swamped in peat or in the scent of rot. Merchant ships waylaid, nomadic clans found slain to the last, the houses of ladies and lords set to flame in the night. She begs your mother's support, as a long-time ally and your mother's friend from youth. And you know what your mother expects, so you give the orders, you send the company. And you curse and weave magic and make the sacrifices to Teufelshunde and Isaac, you're asking them to strengthen your will, nerve the arms of the slave catchers and soldiers riding northwards. But the months turn into seasons into years, and the responses you get trail off, the number of those returning grows fewer, the territory sliding further into that mysterious black hole. You catch your mother's lips pursuing you as she passes in the corridor, and that stings worse than any curse. And by the point that you walk into your own rooms at the end of another fruitless day, already pulling out your hairpins, and hear the door close behind you by someone else's hands, you almost want to fling up your hands and say, of course. Of course you would have failed at this too, that you couldn't even keep your own adversary from sneaking in. What you would do, in his place, would be to take you as a weapon. Scourge your mind with sorcery and tell your mother you would only return it if she gave you the land you wanted. But you still have some pride. You say, if I call, I could have a dozen guards in here within one heartbeat. He agrees while turning away, saying, you could, but I do not believe you will. Indignation wells up like a sudden flame. Why not? How dare this half-blood, upstart claim to know anything about you, least of all to venture to predict any of your actions? Because you are curious, he says. How far does your mother's land extend? And how many people does she rule, with all their disputes and quarreling? Yet I have not even stepped over your borders. Surely, you could be forgiven for allowing Teufelshunde, and you do not miss the absence of the title, to handle me. Break a little of me on her first, before you come to steal the glory. And even then you are goddaughter. There are spells that could burn us all to ashes, and you would not even have to leave this room to cast them. Well, it is true. Why bother to try and take me alive? But you want to know how I have resisted you this long. More than that, you want to know why. His eyes are gray as a midsummer storm, and it is on the very edge of breaking, sending the hammering rains and howling winds across the land. You say, you wish to take me as hostage. His grin is a slash in a dark, utterly mirthless, no. You wish to kill me, and are just taking your time to gloat before. Even less. You hiss, then what, and let your fingers creep towards the knife hidden beneath the folds of your skirts. Do you think to force me to do? His eyebrows lift in surprise. He says, I think not to force anything. If it is truly your desire, we may go back to the lot throw of war. You can sacrifice all the human lives you want on my spears, and I will leave you to live your life within a walled garden, believing it to be the universe entire. Day after day in the gilt stockades of your traditions and rituals and pleasures until your own soul is gilded too, until the crown grows into your skull, the chain into your hand. Until this shell of jewels and images is too thick to ever shed, and you wither and die within it, and no one will notice, not even the gods you claim to serve. Or break it now. Come with me, and I will show you the world as it is in truth. How, outside of this refuge, a gesture encompassing all the walls and furnishings in sight, the universe really treats thinking creatures, even of your own blood. Out there, the gods answer no one. I promise, you will be abandoned to hunger and pain and grief, torn bone-deep by thorns, forced to see death face to face, and you will be more alive then than in all the years you have already passed. You want a true adversary. You want to fight a war. Come then, and earn it yourself. He lifts his chin, and something flashes white across his cheek. Spaced as your fingers would be, if you held them up against his skin. You curl your hands into fists. I cannot. Can't you? You are not your mother's heir, nor destined like your brothers for marriage. A younger daughter, you are free. The threat is implicit, remain thus. He said, come with me and live. Unbidden, a memory wells up before you, The preparation for the Veravedi, when your aunts had led you out at nightfall, taking you down, on stairways barely used, until the stone grew cold and stale. Although now you know that at their base is only the warm and holy well that only your age had kept hidden from you before. When first you had felt yourself step beyond the bounds of the sun's domain, you had halted, thinking, I am walking into my tomb. The walls would have sealed themselves over you, the stones slid and fallen, and you would have been bound there eternally. Young, and sacred, and unchanging in your skyless sepulchre. Had it not been for the grip, one on each of your younger hands, you might have bolted, flung yourself back up the stairs and out through the palace corridors and into the garden, into the grey and storm-swept horizon. Your heart is very good at lying. You had always told yourself that that was only what it had done, for of course, you are not dead, had emerged like a wasp from its old skin and been named woman. Now you wonder. His mouth at your throat burns, like the first stroke of lightning. He watches you, when it is over, getting up and pouring out water to clean the amber from between your legs. Like a leopard, or a wolf, something languid and fearless of the night, for it knows there are no greater dangers there than it. You pull on your trousers, and then, as an afterthought, the padded linen tunic and corselet that had been bestowed upon you at your Veravedi. Every girl of sufficient birth received one in the ceremony, though of different materials depending on her family's means, bronze or horn or leather. It was the final symbol of the authority you stepped into, the strength of will each daughter of Davon was expected to have developed by the time she came of age, that you be garbed as a commander of armies, as one who would and could defend Davon against all its foes. The weight of its layers of gleaming scales settles comfortingly down over your breasts, hugging the curve of your back. You feel strangely vulnerable, like a mayfly that has just shed its carapace, still soft and pale underneath, wanting some kind of protection until your new skin hardens. Something to shelter under. Or perhaps that is just that steady gaze, pressing against your back. You pick up your comb, begin scraping the wisps of your hair back. For something to say, you ask, what did you do with my slave catchers? A small wry laugh. You turn in time to see him offer an equanimous shrug. Not all of them are dead. For some reason, this is very funny. You are bent double with laughing. Come on, you say, when you can breathe again, and lead him to your window, fling open the shutters onto the blood-red sunrise. The heavy, rich smell of the oleander vines and cash of flowers drifts in, and you take his hand and pull him out into it, palms wrapping around bark, ankles pressing into clefts. Your anklets ring as you drop down onto the ground. He cocks his head at the noise, then drops to a crouch and unhooks them with deft fingers, asking no permission. Minutes ago, you had opened your body to him, drunk serum from his lips. This feels far more precious, the gold sliding off into the dirt. Nonetheless, you are not righteous. This is made very clear, when first he drags you through a shiver of space and out into a sprawling camp, a labyrinth of tents built from hide or sclerotia or still-living branches, woven tight in webs. In every movement, every word, every look from those who inhabit it. Home, you may have been Pelargia, lady of the fortress, but it is a fortress constructed entirely of sand, perhaps impressive in outward appearance, but underneath so unformed that even a gentle rain could wash it away. The followers who rename you aright, Lovataar, weak one, are pale and stocky, scarred, closed down and untrusting. An army made up of people who never before deserved to be people. The difference, they don't have to say, their entire existence cries this statement, as you walk along the trampled used trails and receive 1,000 glass, sharp stares, is that you deserve to not deserve to be a person. Your mirror is made of burnished bronze, and turns all colors fire. Even the moonlight flooding in through your window it can warm to a faint yellow, as you shed clothing and boots, unhook your belt and drop it, and all your tools whole onto the sleeping platform. It is startling, to catch your face in it. Other women would kill to have hair like yours, you were always complimented. Rarely have you ever needed to dye it. Only once, you think, before your Veravedi, and then only to fulfill the traditional preparations. The copper ash tone considered most desirable, that most women scrub walnut and henna into their scalps, day on day, to acquire sprouts for you effortlessly. Other women would kill to have eyes like yours. Does not all poetry speak of heroines whose eyes are dark as ink, rich as oiled wood? Do not all tales spend lines upon them? And of course, the deer and horses, leopard and corsac and wild rams still gambol and dance over your shoulders, forearms, down onto your ankles, wound about with the lily and the rose, and that no one else could achieve at any price, killing or no, for the life in them is yours and yours alone. A history, a name, an identity, all brought with you, out of the past you said you had relinquished but haven't yet, because there it is before you, in burnished bronze reflection. Your knife parts from the platform. The blade opens up the wall of stylized thorns wrapping above your elbow as easily as if they were in truth new shoots, riding weak ones where you were once ramparts, then raises itself to your temple. The strands do not snap cleanly, scraping over the edge, pulling on your scalp, but it is enough. A lock slithers down to pool on the blanket, then another, and another, until a cloud of copper ash surrounds you. The blade has just settled in the crease of your eyelid when the door relaxes. Karim, he asks, in your own tongue. But you are silent, and do not move until he repeats, Aki, in his, because your tongue is sinful and cruel. What are you doing? What does it look like? You want to snarl. Your bones leak, your heart beats Dave on. Return again to systole. Gold, drawn and spooled and melted and drawn again. They cannot be cut out like you should, like he needs you to, lest you end up poisoning his entire revolution. You opened a butterfly cocoon once only recently. Has the memory brought any guilt, the thing so small, so undefended, and found nothing? Only a black and sticky mess of tissue that bore no resemblance to any insect you knew. Must you not be remade entirely too, stripped down like a broken cart, digested into nothing like the caterpillar? Is it not wrong that anything remains of what you were? But you cannot do this. Once you split your nerves, the blade will drop too soon from your hand, and will not be able to reach the entrail and bone. You want to say you should have killed me. You could even turn it into a demand, make up for that, then kill me now. After all, it wouldn't be like killing a real person, just that shell of greed and violence. You were too late. I already withered, am already gone. What your truth can destroy, it should. Even, especially, if that's me. But he won't. That's true too, and you hate it, that he'll force you to keep existing like this. He runs a hand through the new cropped frizz covering your scalp. You feel him smudge something warm and sticky, and when he lifts his palm away it is marked with honey, bright in the firelight. You should no longer bleed gold. You have been eating his food, drinking his water for moons now, and the gods of Davon will surely have withdrawn their favor from you. It should be read again. Why is it not? In time, his domain expands like a dagger across a field, and the tents grow, and remodel, and become citadels with mineralized walls and chitin-smooth faces. You are walking through the corridors of one when, suddenly, you are seized and thrown into the wall. A glimpse of pale, bone-threaded braids resolves itself into a flint knife pressing itself to your larynx. Ion's newest rescue, he collects you like a pack of hunting hounds, the half-blind guard. A variety of instinctual things panic, at the smarting of your shoulder and your face, at the touch of that blade. But a small, savage part of you is glad, for the pain feels like justice. He snarls, saying, I ought to kill you. It might, somewhat, discredit Ion to claim that this moment is more a moment of perfect clarity than that oleander-scented dawn. But calm pours through you like a stream loosed, and you think, yes, this is the test. Here finally I shall be weighed, shall be struck on the touchstone, and then shall know, whether I am good or bad, no longer have to deal with this fog of uncertainty. Then do it. If you live, then he accepts that you have been redeemed, and you may truly say to yourself that you are clean, hands no longer oil-slicked. If you die, you never were, and so your killing will be merciful. You shall not have to live any longer in your degradation, your own pollution. There is no possible unjust end to this. Besides, Ion shall forgive him. Your Kasek truly, deeply enjoys forgiving people. Honestly, he will probably be grateful for the opportunity. Orok leans harder onto you, your collarbone grinds painfully. The edge bites, and you feel the splitting of your skin, the blood trickle down into the hollow of your throat. The dragonfly flutter of your heart threatens to break out of your ribcage. He snarls, yanks the edge away, then turns and stalks wordlessly off. Your fingers brush over your wound, and lift away a warm smear. It is a bright garnet, and entirely yours, and you laugh. Your eldest sister is a reflection of your mother, now. Or perhaps she always was, and it is you looking at her with new eyes now, made clear in your last ectasis. You had not ever thought to return to these pillars and corridors, but perhaps you should have. Everybody is a tale, fundamentally, written by the gods into stone and flank and time. It is appropriate that the midpoints should call back to the ends, that everything should turn in cycles at the last and draw you back to the home you abandoned for a deliverer in which you had not yet believed and a deliverance for which you had not yet known your need. Her eyes are terrified and wide, as you have backed her up against the sandstone. There is a guard sprawled between you, the sword that did not defend him fallen by his hand. It would be nice to be able to say you regret this, tearing down your own past, but it wouldn't be accurate. You don't look, as a wet organic sound behind you heralds your mother's death. Your Kasek does what he must, it is not to be questioned. But your sister screams, and seizes the dropped sword, and flings herself at his back. When you blink, you are straddling her hips and the gold in her plates cutting into the heel of your hand. Amber squeezes out between your knuckles, covers your wrist and her face and neck and runs in rivulets out onto the floor to mingle with the sludge that is no longer her brain, now that it is dashed upon the flagstones. For good measure, your palm loosens again and comes down on her temple. Sutures and new-made joints crackle under the force. He raises one eyebrow at you, when your hands are finally willing to relinquish their hold, and you lift your head. No one touches you. You say, in explanation, "You are too precious to me for that. At least, not until the messenger has barely left before you go to your knees, howling. You want your mouth to shape no, want to be able to indulge even one moment of denial, claim that it can't be true were it not for that perfidious heart of yours, which is so good at lying and yet will not deign to it now. It says with adamantine certainty that yes, they have taken your lord from you, and put him to death on their machines, and you were not there, you couldn't even witness it as they sawed off the heart of the Empire savages, barbarians. There is no curse to encompass this. Let their names be struck out, and the names of all their family and to 60 generations, let them never to have been. But your curse dissolves only into wordless wailing again. What use is it? It cannot bring back your hope, your light. And when you had been offered the darkness and the suffering of the world along with the sweet, you do not think this was what was meant, because this is more than darkness, this is not describable. For who would create a word for an utter nothing? Who could impose meaning on the complete absence thereof? Because all the meaning there was in him. He was everything in all your life, and therefore the existence you are agonizingly aware still continues wretched and wrong cannot be life. But not even you can weep forever. So eventually, your lungs expand and draw one deep shaking breath, and without much of your input a hand lifts itself and brushes clear your vision, and fully emptied, with nothing more to cling to. You simply accept it. The truth he always wanted you to know. You are not righteous, and never shall be. You have always been poisonous, ruthless to your enemies. Never redeemed, because there is no price high enough to match the monstrosity embedded in you since your creation. What is beneath your violence, your dominion? He had asked you, and here is the answer. It is dominion all the way down. With the deathless, you hated Devon. Before, you hated all lands, but there is no one in the world who has not, at one time or another, been your enemy. And now that the only leash that ever held you is no more, why should they not all burn? The sun rose, and Nadox wandered. Where to, where from? In days of the Davites it was a question of importance, a question begged by the still aching wounds left by bloody basalt, then begged by his duty to Ion, now begged by its own answers. Sometimes, Nadox wondered if it was still a question worth asking. When, why, what, how, all seemed a tad more important. It mattered not. Libraries rose and fell with the seasons, ignorance and knowledge swelled in equal measure, patterns formed and pointed to the same mysterious ends. All of it, too slow beneath Nadox's feet, too fast for the pit of dread in his innards. Books only said so much, knowledge dripped into a canyon as mountains bled. But the landscape changed with time, and Nadox had time. The sun set, and Nadox wandered. Enlightenment, apotheosis, near immortality, if such was the apex of being, an immortal drifter yet shackled to his own mutilated form, Nadox pitied the men around him. There were times when he longed to collapse into a ball and scream, stopping the world for the scant few seconds luck would allow him before existence continued, before the heel of an archon inevitably crushed him against the dirt. To crawl into the darkest available corner, and lie still for as long as he was allowed. Nadox was not proud of such times, nor their increasing frequency following Ion's disappearance. Foraging, drinking, sleeping, such were liabilities discarded on the path to apotheosis, base needs cruelly instituted by the gods on the lesser folk. Physically, Nadox walked without them. Spiritually, some distant fragment of the sufferer he once was looked jealously at the rare life around him. Did he miss the taste of meat, the chill of drink, the serenity of dreams? Or did he miss the hunt, the work one put into living from day to day? Perhaps he missed his humanity. Perhaps he was still human. The all-seeing saw all, every theory and every bit of evidence, and every bit of contradiction. Extra veins pumping blood back into missing hearts, where arteries that fit perfectly wait patiently to nourish 1,000 organs each. Nadox's feet ached. He hadn't even been using them. Telescopic eyes observed Nadox from afar, forming the unspoken bond between predator and prey. Nadox was not caught unaware. Indeed, it was impossible for him to be anything but mindful. He heard the turning of gears, vented steam, the monotonous invocation of a broken god. Nadox slowed his pace, steadily closing the gap between himself and his stalker without drawing suspicion. Closer, closer, the sound of a sword unsheathed, of accelerating cogwork and an engine burning with singular purpose. Curious, Nadox allowed his prospective assassin the first strike. The blade penetrated through his spine and bent his body to face the emerging stars. They would be rather beautiful that night. Die, Sarkite! The Mekhanite shout was tinny, echoed by itself. His transfiguration was incomplete. By the infinite designs of Mekane, you will be purged. Nadox's sewn-shut lips nearly curled into a smile. It had been at least 2 millennia since he last experienced impalement. From the moment Nadox sensed his stalker, it was clear he had mistaken him for a lesser shepherd of the flesh. Nadox endeavored to elucidate his attacker on the severity of his error. Unstable flesh poured from the wound, a writhing mass far larger than his taut skin appeared capable of containing. Bones fractured and reconfigured themselves in support of new limbs. Sinewy tendrils tore away his former husk like an insect post-metamorphosis. 100 fists took shape, whose fingers unfurled like a lotus in bloom to reveal 100 unblinking eyes. He rose into the air, alive, exalted in the truth of his ascendant form. Most would flee in horror or fall to their knees in worship. Nadox had already foreseen that this man was different. Undeterred by the display, the brazen warrior pulled his blade from the undulating vessel and continued his fight. An amused curiosity stayed 100 hands of flesh, enabling those of bronze. The Mekhanite tore, slashing and piercing at Nadox's rippling flesh, only to reveal yet more flesh. The fruits of his harvest reintegrated with Nadox, far too quick for his adversary's blade, yet curiously he fought. But the Mekhanite's mind drifted towards his deific armaments, and Nadox decided he was done observing. The first strike sabotaged the second, throwing the Mekhanite across the dunes. Regaining bearings left him only enough time to dodge Nadox's 100-handed charge. Nadox's next strike, a lazy backhand, split against his opponent's parry, the Mechanites buy for time as his armament charged. Now on the defensive, the Mechanite jumped back, too close to charge yet too far to reach. He was stalling. Nadox would have known that even without the panic running off his mind. The Mechanite ran, and a rolling mass of flesh followed. It mattered not. Nadox was faster, no matter the Mechanite's head start. Navigating the same dunes gave the far larger Nadox superior traction, superior navigation. And, as Nadox realized far too late, inferior turning. The Mechanite threw himself to the side, using his momentum to resume his retreat perpendicular to Nadox's trajectory. In the rush, Nadox misjudged his own movements, running a wide circle intersecting with the Mechanite too early, an eccentricity that brought him further and further off the mark, but, regardless, the dizzying orbit had encircled his foe. Nadox pulled in, spiraling steadily towards the Mechanite. Regardless, the precision required left time for the Mechanite to plan, to avoid his trample and buy more time. As such, Nadox grounded himself to a sudden stop moments before he anticipated the Mechanite's escape, rooted by a dozen hands, one of which came up to snatch his opponent from beneath the sands. Again, Nadox had botched the timing. He had not traditionally needed to count in moments, he supposed. The Mechanite slipped from his fingers, his base instincts searching for balance on his knuckles. He had a choice, drop, or remain still. It ultimately mattered little. The Mechanite jumped back, right into a swift clap. Time froze for Nadox. Nadox studied the Mechanite's angle, the Mechanite's form, the Mechanite's trajectory, viscous in the desert air, flowing as pitch across a tongue. He studied the plates of his face, contorted in a desperate grimace. In frozen time, Nadox rolled the compound images through his mind, putting story to them, and only too late did he begin to study the armament pointed at his center of mass. Pain. Searing pain. A pained wheeze escaped from Nadox's remaining maws, fruitlessly tearing at the stitches that bound them. Melted flesh poured down his body, still sizzling with heat. The force had driven him back, and with every minute movement more flesh sloughed off, staining the sand in reds and whites and browns. Nadox's body screamed at itself. It screamed that Nadox was going to die over and over, over and over, over and over and over, that even though he knew he would survive, that he might as well have died. Nadox retreated beneath the sands and waited. The cool sands beneath the surface gave time for him to think, time to plan. Whatever his body said was wrong, Nadox would live another day, but it was a thought that failed to ease his burnt and irritated flesh. Emasculation, suture, force muteness, such aches Nadox had grown to ignore. Deific fire was another matter entirely, and would remain one for however long Nadox took to regenerate. The Mechanite was a distraction, a waste of time, courtesy of the Archons. He had to die. Tendrils of flesh dug into Nadox's surroundings, feeling for movements from above as the all-seeing's eyes probed the minds of life above. The sudden shift in perspective sabotaged immediate comprehension, further hindered by freshly burned skin. A scorpion desperate not to be crushed. A bewildered serpent looking for food. A shrub nearly dead. The Mechanite. Myriad mounds of sand, each of which might or might not have been Nadox. Sand shifted, and so did the Mechanite. Animals burrowed and ran. Nadox felt such things above him, even as the pain obfuscated what stood above where. Clarity building. Now. Nadox emerged from the sand beneath the Mechanite, swallowing him in a tangle of arms, tendrils, and sharpened bone. He paid no mind to the Mechanite's resistance. Such struggle was futile, wrapped in a cocoon of enveloping flesh. The Mechanite's brain was human, intact, a contrast to the cages and wires of barrow bronze that connected it to his metallic form. A round peg of flesh in a bronzen square hole, one Nadox would be removing soon enough. Nadox would not have been able to explain why he peeked into the Mechanite's psyche. Peering from behind the folds of the Mechanite's brain was a man named Jerdikias. Derdikias was a legate faithful to Mekhain. He had been awake for 3.5 fortnights prior, stalking Nadox from shadows cast behind the dunes, behind shrubs and rocks and trees. Curiosity paved the pathways of memory, a desire to meet a fellow wanderer. Betrayal, to find him an agent of the flesh. Derdikias longed for a better, more rational world, under the guidance of Mekhain. He longed for order, security, apotheosis. To end the reign of the flesh, of Yaldabaoth and Scarlet Kings and that which made holes in the shapes of worms. Nadox paused. Derdikias felt terrified, betrayed. In seeking companionship, he had confronted a Sarkite, a living legacy of the flesh's corruption. What should have been a routine cleanse ended in its jaws, trapped in a cage of certain death. Not even the holy armaments of Mekhain could save him. Derdikias was going to die. Derdikias did not want to die. Nadox uncurled, spitting the Mekhanite Derdikias out of his person. 5 times the sun set. 5 times the sun rose. Derdikias was clever. He was strong, he was durable, he was deadly with blade and flame. He was tenacious and quick and fanatical, and yet most importantly, he was human. Over the course of 6 days and 5 nights, Derdikias engaged in a continuous assault against Nadox. Scorched glass, broken dunes, rivers of Nadox's blood, all marked the various assaults, engagements, one-man tactics and formations that outlined their protracted battle. Derdikias fought with the ferocity of an army and the courage of a badger, a ferocity that waned with time while courage waxed. On, most probably, the hour of noon on the 6th day, Derdikias took the 4th step of a charge, missed his footing, and let himself fall supine over the sands. The fire that had sustained his charge had diminished, retreating to his eyes. He could do naught but stare at Nadox. In his head, he lied to himself, told himself he wasn't afraid to die at the hands of a worthy servant of the flesh. Nadox simply stared back. Slowly, steadily, he reformed. Bones snapped and viscera tore, compressing themselves into the impossibly small shape of a traveler. The shadow over the desert retracted to that of an average man. Derdikias laughed, and then he was unconscious. Derdikias awoke, 3 hours later, to Nadox. Nadox admittedly hadn't been paying too much mind. His attention had been focused on several scrolls he bought at the last town over. The blade shoved through his head was almost quaint, really. "You're awake," the flesh in Nadox's head contracted, gently spitting the blade out. "I trust you slept well." Nadox blocked the next punch with his free hand. "Get out of my mind, Sarkite." Derdikias kicked at his side with half-hearted investment. It mattered not. His will to fight had outlived his will to kill, for the moment. "Apologies, I can't." That scroll was almost useless. Nadox would want to sell it in the next town, once he finished taking notes. "I have no tongue." Derdikias merely snarled, kneeling down to look over Nadox's shoulder. "You speak my tongue, but your script you are Davite. By birth, not by choice." "You," Derdikias quickly stood up, catching himself as he nearly yelled in frustration. His next attempt to speak ended with a yell he failed to suppress. Derdikias's next words came only after a few minutes more of pacing. "Enough. Who are you?" Well, enough was enough. Nadox packed his research material back into its appropriate bag, and stood back up. "Clavigar Nadox, the all-seeing? If you'll excuse me," Nadox began to walk away. Nadox had not gone but a single step before the Mekhanite attacked once more, with words rather than armaments. "Clavigar. I am not done." Derdikias ran with the limited grace expected of desert-focused augmentation. If Nadox wanted, he would have reminded him just how useless that was in comparison to apotheosis. "Where are you going? To what ends?" Nadox remained silent. Even without a tongue, what was there to say? Surely the all-seeing eye sees all. What's left to see? Backwards, Derdikias kept pace. Nadox's own pace enabled such mobile interrogation. "I've seen you," You revise nothing, write nothing, say nothing. You watch. But the flesh is not simple, therefore, to what end? The sand beneath Nadox ran hot, a sensation growing stronger as he stopped. Research. I am researching. Even as Nadox stood still, Derdikias moved, paced a circle around him like a hound, never touching sand for long enough to burn. Nadox felt his mind, easily as restless as his feet, racing between confusion and desperation, hidden behind a thin veneer of dogged curiosity, thinner than the plates of his skull. Ha! Researching, says the all-seeing eye? Are you missing a piece of the puzzle? Perhaps it was folly to have spared Derdikias. If so, it was sustained, a mistake days in the making, a flaw in his understanding of Ion's words. Momentary anger, otherwise. The sand burnt. All right. I think you know. Derdikias stopped, miming a smug superiority he didn't really feel, before pacing again. You have the piece. But you've fitted the puzzle incorrectly. Nadox continued on, only half out of duty, and half out of courtesy to Derdikias' near-melting feet. You've seen the signs. There's something beyond the flesh, salvation outside of it. The sand beneath Nadox was less granular than before. Some part of him wished for an outcrop, an escape from the heat. But machinery is a trapping of godliness. Capitulation to a higher power than yourself or Ion. Nadox stopped. You think you've conquered flesh. But Derdikias held up a finger. Flesh has conquered you. You wallow in it, wrap yourself in its excess like an archon, and Nadox blinked, and found himself pointing a barb of sharpened bone at Derdikias' throat. Through Derdikias' mind's eye, Nadox saw instead what appeared to him to be a Davite priestess, wielding a blade of crimson-stained basalt. Nadox's armament fell to the side, and Nadox walked as fast as he could. Nadox needed neither heat, nor rest, nor much of anything gained by curling up against a fire under a rare outcropping of stone. And yet, here he was. The heat would not last, an ironic development, starkly illuminated by the cold of the desert. Too little a shrub in sight to fuel the flames, and Nadox was not certain he'd be willing to offer up fat to such a temporary and superfluous cause. Nadox was going to live, whether everything else did or didn't. He closed his eyes. Hello again. Nadox's physical eyes remained closed. For a scant eternity, only Derdikias' soft clicking broke the thin silence of night wind and crackling fire. Nadox remained where he was, curled like a fetus against the fire. I apologize. I should not have threatened you. Derdikias' mind raced, even as Nadox restrained himself from looking too far inside, lest he rediscover the memory. I suppose over the wind but under the fire, Nadox could hear the soft ruffling of Derdikias' travel cloak as he sat. I'm sorry. There was no need to antagonize you. As I did. You don't need to apologize, Legate. There was a genuine sorrow in the back of Derdikias' mind, a genuine atom of intoxicatingly rare compassion, hidden among the confusion. You didn't know. I suppose I don't. The two sat very still, until daybreak swept the fire's last embers to the winds. For the next few days, Derdikias was silent, his mind withdrawn. Nadox tried not to pry, but it was asking one not to stare at the moon as they watched the skies. Derdikias' thoughts were a poisoned oasis in a desert of nothing. Nadox walked, and Derdikias trailed behind. His faceplate, near expressionless in its make, barely cast gaze high enough to follow the movements of Nadox's robes. Derdikias made little noise, but for the listless grinding of moving parts. Nadox had spared him, and he walked as a dead man regardless. The roads. Nadox had somehow lost track of them. Several more days of wandering. Derdikias said little. Affirmations and negations to questions of need, half-hearted advice on which horizon to walk, soft-spoken Mekhanite prayers that gradually lost meaning. He barely kept pace, hardly kept track. When the two finally arrived at the next town, Nadox had expected Dirdikias to look happier, had expected a change of scenery begetting a change in attitude. And yet, Dirdikias simply looked listlessly at the ground, now paved and heavy-trodden, a melancholy passenger to Nadox's odyssey. The same passage. Nadox had just read the same passage. The small building that passed for this town's library was empty, save for Nadox and Dirdikias. Its denizens took their business outside the walls, quietly or otherwise insulated from Nadox's study. Dirdikias sat in a far corner, moving little and speaking less. Ultimately, it left Nadox with the perfect environment for study, an opportunity that, try as he might, Nadox ultimately squandered on the same passage. Dirdikias. He had changed something, a misplaced step in the process of research. Or was it the dynamic as a whole? Nadox closed his eyes. He thought of Ion. His merciful gaze, his soft-spoken confessions and his rhetoric of torn flesh and rebirth in viscera. Of the half-dead wasteland where they last spoke. Nadox thought of his perfect, beautiful form, and of the hideous nascent archon that gestated within. Of how his clavigar, lost without the guidance of the perfect surgeon, had scattered to the wind. Of the final question left behind. His mind wandered to his travels, of the gradual decay of his surroundings. Of hungry cicadas, screaming clouds of violet vibrations, and a myriad of their vicious peers. He thought of what he saw in the folds of Dirdikias' psyche. The passion. The need for change. The common enemy. Dirdikias. Nadox was answered with the tiny grind of metal. Care to join me? Dirdikias stood, already a significant improvement in his situation. What do you mean? In research. There was no easy way to covertly vomit the collection of documents Nadox kept in his person, at least in company. Still, Dirdikias had seen more than his share of Nadox's insides, leaving comparatively little shock to be had. Dirdikias approached with caution, a caution Nadox thought inappropriate given the past several weeks, but nonetheless a caution. At some invisible precipice between himself and the table, Dirdikias stopped. The air was still, the wind calm. You'll forgive me for my caution. Dying sunlight reflected off the fire in Dirdikias' eyes. I already do. The dusk passed with stories of the old gods, and those who lived beneath them. The sun rose, and Dirdikias followed Nadox. I recognize that. Nadox continued his craft, though his mind's eye looked up. A simple hinged joint. Dirdikias' face had been replaced with bronze, without the necessary muscles to squint. Even so, Nadox could feel the muscle memory of the flesh that once was attempting to do just that. Right, but the structure. As a whole, I recognize the structure, how you've built the arm. My own innards appear nearly identical. A pause. Nadox examined his own handiwork, comparing it with the internal anatomy of Dirdikias. Nadox continued. Dirdikias crouched to face their patient. How do you feel? The little shepherd boy felt many things, or at least, Nadox felt many things through the shepherd boy's thoughts. Bewilderment, at his brand new arm. Fear, that either of them may demand an unspoken price that could not be paid. Gratefulness, despite the circumstances. All bled into apprehension, what to do now that his limbs were whole again. As his mind turned to the thought of repayment, Nadox turned and walked away. The sun set, and Dirdikias walked with Nadox. The book, predictably, was written in a different tongue to the last library, days away. Not that it mattered. Language was a barrier Ion had thrust Nadox over long ago. From the thoughts bubbling on the surface of his companion's mind, Dirdikias was not quite so fortunate. Nadox took note of the signs, the histories, the pieces of possible solutions, compiling every scrap into a written record, a library in miniature, a personal schema against the Archons. That it was in Dirdikias' tongue was convenient. That was what Nadox told himself, even as the muscles of his digits struggled to adapt to the new alphabet. As Nadox researched, recorded, reviewed, Dirdikias read, tried to read. There was a limit to his comprehension, a language barrier he could not cross. Frustration radiated from his mind, tainted with disappointment. Nadox closed his eyes, all of them, but the ones needed for the task at hand. Minutes passed. Hours. He had been reading a scroll on ancient rites, dedications to crowned cicadas and holes in the shapes of worms, when Derdikias collapsed onto the seat beside him. Nothing. I learned nothing. I cannot read this script. I'm sorry, right. Derdikias simply stared at the table upon which Nadox read. It's been several fortnights. An hour of rest. Dawn would be soon, if Nadox had to guess. Best now. Do what you need. Derdikias leaned against Nadox, and let himself dream. His chassis was warm. The sun rose. Nadox and Derdikias walked. Thank you again, so much, for your kindness. The fat man before them, who had pleaded with Derdikias to help him fix his cart, wanted to kill both of them. Ill intent boiled off his head like a ruptured cyst. He intended to do so in service to the Scarlet King. Nadox found it all very quaint. He would fail, of course. His poison would constrict the heart, of which Nadox had several and Derdikias one of bronze. Once that failed, he planned to eviscerate them with novice magics and parlor tricks. The farce would most probably end when Nadox would swiftly decapitate him with a keratin blade, after which he would consume his flesh and be on his way. That was if Nadox played along. He had far more important business to attend to, compared to humoring the follower of a fellow deific eunuch. There must be something, anything, I could do to repay you. Nadox was surprised, at least. Worship of the Scarlet King was traditionally restricted to the Davites. Its spread this far south suggested dreadful things, especially in absence of the coastline. The work of archons. Bone merged and tore beneath Nadox's robes. Nadox silently prayed to Ion, and it was nothing. Derdikias had already finished repairs. You owe us nothing. Farewell, and good travels. Derdikias turned to walk away, and Nadox couldn't help but follow. Is he still following us? The fat man, Derdikias meant. His ill intent was conspicuous enough against the backdrop of Derdikias's warmth through the void of the wilderness. Nadox had not gotten around to killing him, yet. Later, perhaps. Derdikias would stop as dusk broke, out of misplaced courtesy. It mattered not. The fat man lacked the capacity to kill either of them. His approach was cautious. Nadox knew he knew that they knew of him, knew and could guess at his intent. The man supposed, and Nadox and Derdikias knew, that such an attempt would be futile. Ultimately, however, Nadox did not know why the man continued his approach. Heat and exhaustion looked to be wearing on him with each step, but the man continued regardless. His dedication was impressive, nearly compensating for his inabilities. Nearly. But Nadox and Derdikias had time, while the man's mortality had been slowly robbing him of such from the day he was born. Time ran out a dozen paces from Nadox and Derdikias, and the man collapsed. He would die soon. The two of them would do well to leave him to his fate. Nadox spotted Derdikias reaching for his water skin. The sun rose, and Nadox, Derdikias, and Fong walked. As Nadox meted out the coins necessary for provisions, his mind began to wander. It did that these days. The two, now three, were losing pace. Looking back on his travels, Derdikias had eventually signaled a suspicious uptick in progress. Even so, the addition of a third appeared to have spoiled that. How much so, Nadox was unsure. Measures of the abstract were rarely quantifiable, especially when Nadox himself seemed to be lacking the full context of the work ahead. The days were not growing shorter, Nadox realized. He had just been forced to pay more attention to them. Derdikias had a clock that ran in months, Fong hours. If the toll of time was to be decried, it laid firmly on the lodestone of Fong. The easiest solution would be to kill him, and continue without him. That, somehow, was also the hardest. With renewed attention to the sand through the sieve came the realization of the grains falling around his fingers. Days shone brighter. Sand ran hotter. The pleasant nausea in Nadox's stomach, a nausea he hadn't quite noticed until late, roiled fiercer yet. Intensities he hadn't felt since Ion, since Nadox had fought with someone at his side, since he had done more than just walking, reading, writing. Reunion with the complex depths of being. When Nadox moved, he left footprints, displaced grains, and a slithering track. Nadox left an imprint. Had he always left one? He must have. He must. Nadox thought back to Derdikias. He found that his thoughts did not examine, compare, or attempt to decrypt. Nadox merely thought of him, and felt fortunate. Davite twine tore at the edges of the holes it threaded through. It could not stop the curl of his lips. With the transaction concluded, Nadox walked back to his friend and follower. The sun rose, and Nadox, Derdikias, and Fang walked. When the sun next rose, Nadox, Derdikias, Fang, and Yungsai walked. One day, the sun rose to Nadox, Derdikias, and their fellow travelers. Later, the sun rose to Nadox, Derdikias, and their followers. Soon, friends, acolytes, family. The sun set. Nadox sat alone. Around him, followers set up their tents, counted their provisions, prepared for the coming night. A select few stayed awake, studied, theorized. Lovataar mingled with Mekhanite, mingled with insomniac and spirit, and those passionate enough to sacrifice sleep for progress. Quietly, the world continued to turn for another night. Derdikias sat across from him, transcribing lessons, schematics, all he had gleaned over the day. Connections Nadox had overlooked, conclusions divergent of the arguments Nadox had drawn, pieces of the puzzle, to synthesize with what was already written. For the first time in centuries, Nadox allowed himself rest. In Memoria Adytum. I say this that you suffer. There's this girl. No, she would say, if any dared to ask. There was never a girl. Would tear the words off tablet or stone with razor-sharp claws, then the thought out of the mind of whoever had written them in a spray of lipid and CSF. Perhaps a sword blank, if thoughts of origin must be endured, but to be a girl implies softness, sweetness, implies the existence of a family and of something other than pure single-minded tempering, rasping to the point of the scale and the spear. But there is this girl. She is born into the late summer, her cradle the curve of the mountains and the first noise in her ears the river, running down westwards to a sparkling sea. He is not among the highest chieftains, her father, but he rules a goodly space of land, enough for their entire tribe to farm upon and fish upon, to herd their flocks of sheep from mountain to meadow upon. Enough to provide for a thriving population, a population that can pay enough taxes to support its nobility, and provide enough bodies to make full use of the resources that Batoni had given unto them. Enough bodies to support the yearly tribute. It is voluntary, the Empress in the East insists. Intended to foster a closer relationship between their nations, and to help ensure that the children of Karcist are as invested in the state that rules them as their own small tribes. So each year, 50 daughters, of an age to be married, are sent east over the mountains. 50 sons. What is done with them is unknown. None are returned nor ever send missives back. The emissaries always come at the beginning of the spring, when they ought to be celebrating the sowing and the quickening of the soil. Perhaps it is out of spite, or perhaps they just want to prove their superiority that much the stronger. See, we can order you to give us even your joy, and you obey. So there is a peculiar type of tension that takes form in every person that reaches maturity. On the one hand, they have outlived the illnesses and accidents that fell many children, and they may soon become the lord or lady of their own household, to command their own servants and beget their own line just as their parents did before them. But on the other hand, all of those things may simply never come to pass. They may be dressed in their finest clothes, and paraded before the women from the east, and simply disappear. The ones who are taken are not grieved. They are not dead, so rather than bear that uncertainty eternally, their families just allowed the disappearance. That which is not, if it cannot be proven to have ever been, leaves no emptiness behind itself. Are you worried? One of her friends asks, on the eve before she is to reach the age of womanhood. Even though I know that there is only one chance in hundreds that I am chosen, they say that they sacrifice them, on altars to their gods. And that they bait monsters with them in the woods, and replace their limbs with bronze and their eyes with rock crystal, and use them for soldiers in the vanguards of their armies. There are many rumors about the inhumanity of the diva, each worse than the last. But even so, it feels like, I know it, in my bones, that I will be one of the ones taken this year. Do you? The girl shakes her head. Her braids are piled atop each other like the bricks of a fortress wall that looks out over the water. They do not shift with the motion. My father would never allow that, she says. At least, he would not have. Until the year that the plague comes. Unlike most, this one does not disproportionately target the children and the elderly. Clip off the already ill like one who prunes a grapevine to coax a greater harvest from it next year. This one spares the grandmothers, and the mothers, and brings down daughters in their youths and young men in their time of strength. The ditches and hedgerows are, within the space of one moon, emptied of Altamisa, if anyone wonders how bad it is. So the emissary of the Empress comes to a much diminished population to demand her 100 heads. The girl's father pleads for mercy. He attempts to explain that with so many ill they will not have enough able-bodied to take care of the old, and of children. If she takes her 100 there will be no one left to tend the fields, to harvest the firewood. Perhaps she could take a token number this year, to be fulfilled once their population has recovered. The emissary waits until he has finished speaking. She does not laugh. She does not smile. She makes no pretense of mockery. Would it have been easier if she had? Would that hatred have hit its auto-ignition point in that one moment, and leapt into flame, rather than its months-long smoldering, draining growth? And yet she refuses the plea. Her compatriots enter the crowd, pull out boys trying to hide behind their mothers. The deputy counts, as they line them up like nerve cords through the center of the square 20 and 19, 2 20s, 2 20s and 1. And then they come and point to her. The girl wants something, for her mother to grasp her arm or her father to draw her to him, something to prove that they care, that they won't just lie down and let her be stolen like this. But the deputy beckons with 2 fingers. The set of her brown eyes and olive lips indicates that it will go much harder for the girl, should she refuse. The emissary and her deputies did not bring carts. They walked the pass through the mountains. Not roped together, for where could they possibly run? The path has been turned into little more than a streambed over the winter, as the rains took the easy route down from the highlands rather than percolating slowly through the trees and the tundra, all matted together with roots. Her ankles roll over the loose stones and gullies. Her feet blister, tear open, and bleed through her sandals within the first day. The second is worse, as the trees thin further, and leave them exposed to the biting sky. One of the deputies carries with him a fire and a little birch-bark box. Of course, he only ever lights one, outside the animal hide tent they erect and too far from his captives to lend them any warmth at all, even when the sky is cloudless and thin films of ice fall from the stars. The girl has her own box, inside her heart. And into it she puts the cold, and the pain. She puts the image of the welts on her cohort's hands, and the muffled sounds of hands over lips and knees on arms as the deputies cross nightly to where the boys lie in a line at night. She puts the white shard of bone standing out against the dark void of rent muscle when the girl 2 spaces ahead of her misses her footing on a stone and falls, tumbles down the slope into a steep ravine gouged through the mountains on their right hand. Her screams and wails sound like a rock spirit, echoing between its walls, and the girl mumbles a quick invocation as the deputies, ears seemingly stoppered with wax, heard them remaining along. She locks the hard box tight each sunset, and binds it around with her cordie so that not a single fragment could escape. These things are for later. The girl walks. After all that, what blows her ashes back into flame is not a threshold of cruelty, when they arrive at the Empire's closest trade hub, but a threshold of banality. For this is the terrible secret of the tribute the Empress takes. They are married off, as appeasement and as rewards to minor nobles, allies, and militia leaders. A clever way for the Empress to assert her power over her vassal states and gain a rare resource, for of course no one of pure blood could be given in such a fashion, with which to ensure the fealty of her other lords. The man to whom the girl is given is one of these, many times removed from the royal line, and owner of a moderate span of land and several vassals to manage it. He tells her all of it as they ride through the bee-filled scrublands. His silver-ringed fingers sit calmly on the reins, and she thinks she would rather forge them into spearheads than receive even one upon her own hand. The servants, though, are sympathetic to this withdrawn foreign bride. The head cook allows her to sit on the hearthstones and drink glasses of milk and weak mead. The maid teaches her what Davic words she does not know, and sings her songs in the Northman's tongue. But nonetheless, they all flee at her husband's arrival. By the time she begins to feel ill, she has already not bled for 2 months. Her maids coo over her, rub her back when she is sick, offer sweet teas and rich cakes. To feed the baby, they explain. Her master husband puts his hands around her waist and says, "My daughter," bending to kiss her there on the diaphragm. Davite women don't bleed at all. These same maids had worried in the first month of her marriage until she had explained that she was not dying, gotten the human slaves to corroborate. That twists her gut up even more, her husband, stealing 9 months' worth of humanity from her, continuing to mold her into an alien shape. Her mother would have helped her, were she still in Karcist. She would have told her all to expect, and made her tisanes and massaged her limbs where they ache. But here in the East, alone, she has no one. She takes to meandering around the orchards and the gardens, talking to the wind and the sun, hoping they will convey her prayers to her gods. I do not want to give the world more diva to abuse it. I don't. Why do my sisters and brothers get to be at home, be free, when I am hostage here? It is not fair. It is not just. She looks for the small, yellow flowers of rue every time, and does not find them. But in the absence of yellow, she finds rosy pinks and cool purples, slim-leaved oleander and racemud aconite sprouting as weeds at the edges of the gardens and in the ditches at the roadsides. And the house has a well in the courtyard that supplies most of the water for drinking and cooking and bathing. Her hands are stained green by the time she pushes the last stalks into its mouth and makes her way up the stairs to her own chamber. It is not even yet dusk, but surely no one will question her retiring so early. After all, it is a great endeavor to gestate and bear a daughter, and her serving women have been constantly saying she needs rest. There is a certain lack of satisfaction in it. The savage thing that coils inside her heart wants blood and violence, wants to see the shock and betrayal on her husband's face as she dismantles him piece by piece. His body could be just as useful to her as hers has been made to him. She could string harps with his sinews, split arrowheads from his bones, a waterskin from his stomach so she could cross more wildernesses and this time without torment. But one must be practical. It will do. She spends much of the next day abed, watching the rays of sunlight creep across the floor and up the wall. One of her ladies-in-waiting comes in the morning, but leaves as she feigns sleep. By evening, no one comes. The girl rises. She gathers her few supplies, waterskin, cloak, jewelry to trade. And she slips down the sooty servant's staircase to the kitchen, and out the door, and barefooted onto the empty road and the oncoming dusk. The girl doesn't really know where she wanders the next few days, and doesn't care to know. The brushland is eternal, marked only by wells and fences that appear and disappear at seeming random. Men and poems have spoken of the pangs of guilt, that when one has destroyed with one's actions something one held dear, the suffering of that could be worse than a wound. This cannot possibly be it. They were nothing to her. It is good that they are all dead, and she knows this, deep in her bones, but then what? What explains the ache that melts out through her back? She has retreated so deeply inside herself that she almost trips over the people resting at the side of the road in the shade of a thorn tree. The one looks up, a sudden, alien twist of the head, and stands, wetting its lips. The other's face is veiled, and only its eyes slide to fix on her. "Sister?" asks the standing one, in a woman's voice. Is everything all right?" No, she wants to say, nothing is, not the whole world over. But the tension growing in her back chooses that moment to tear its way free from her, and the last thing she is aware of perceiving are the woman's hands closing around her wrists. They all fall away from her, the awareness of time, location, situation. None matters, she is being rent apart, a single pine needle floating upon an ocean of pain. Its waves crest and break like in the bitterest of storms, scouring the shingle, tearing away every barnacle of thought that attempts to take root in her mind. Whoever it was that screamed in time with each surge has stopped, now, from either hoarseness or exhaustion. Fragments of the outside world slide in, red light through dark veined tent cloth, gentle words in a tongue she does not understand. Someone holds a cup against her mouth, but the bitter liquid just dribbles down the side of her cheek as a spear drives through her gut, and her throat closes up again. Something is wrong. She knows this from the tone of the foreign voices and in her bones, her instincts impotently beating on the inside of her skull. We have to do something. We're dying. We're bleeding. Her minute planktonic consciousness thinks it might welcome death, at this point. And then there is a sudden cartilaginous crack, and both instinct and consciousness sink mercifully down out of the light. She comes to softness and musk, and even before her eyes open, her left fingers close on the fur that drapes over them. Her hips and back still feel like they have been pulled apart at the joints and used for knuckle bones, then reassembled wrongly. Every breath sends a stab of pain through her belly. What has woken her? It is not bright. She has a vague sense of being inside an enclosed space, as the air feels warm and stale and confined. The light seeping through her eyelids is a mustard, buttery yellow. She opens her eyes. She is supine on some type of makeshift cot. To her left, a glacier of white fur tumbles onto its edge. Laying camouflaged among the strands are ash-colored plaits and matted cords of hair, revealed only by the jet beads keeping the ends from unraveling. "I am telling you, your assistance is unnecessary," the fur cloak's owner is saying. She feels the vibrations of the voice in her fingertips. It takes 3 breaths before the voice returns. "Do not concern yourself with that," the speaker says, evidently in answer to some silent response. "I have borne much worse, and you know it." Another meaningful silence from the interlocutor. "I will not—" "No, stop," the silent one must make to grab at the other, for they step back, jarring her cot. "Do not touch me." In shock, her fingers release, and the cloak slides free. The speaker must feel it, for they turn around. "I did not mean you, Kakarga." And now 2 sets of eyes turn to her, and she feels the second even if she only sees the first. If only she had the strength to feel more than mildly embarrassed. Presumably, a question is posed by the other, for the speaker answers, "She is the one who poisoned Subunda's household. Did you not wonder why they did not raise up a militia against us? She said she had slain them all, and we came and found it was true, that they were all dead, or dying. I wanted to make them bleed," she complains. "For all the blood Subunda had stopped her from shedding, these months." The speaker's lips twitch. "Do not question your victories, Kakarga. You achieved your aim, or I presume so. The manner in which you did so is immaterial. But she hasn't, not yet. There are still 49 other offerings in the same position as she was, and the uncounted many since Karcist had sworn vassalhood to the Empire. And it's not right, it's not fair, it's not enough, that she be here and they be there, and everyone of her childhood still unmarred and ignorant, over the mountains. There is a hole in her pelvis, and that others have it filled incenses her. She will rupture like a fresh empyema under the unequal pressures. It cannot be cured with waiting, with Ultimisa. The one, and only, thing she needs is the lance. So when 7 days later she walks on thorns, always will, she will take no pain-free step again, to their red-walled armory and, clinging to the ribs of the wall with one hand, draws from its glutinous sheath a spear, straight-shafted and sturdy. Then, perhaps, is when she steps from the umbra of girl. SCP-5181 Teufelshunde. In March 1918, the German army pushed an offensive west into Allied territories in an attempt to win the war on the Western Front before the United States Armed Forces had an opportunity to fully deploy. By May of that year, the German offensive had reached the north bank of the Marne River at the small village of Château-Thierry, where they encountered the U.S. 3rd Army Division. This forced the German advance to turn west towards the commune of Vaux. That evening the Germans defeated elements of the French armed forces, which allowed them to move into position to flank the U.S. military. In response, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, including the highly decorated Cheyenne Company, moved to intercept along the Paris-Metz highway. After having conducted an all-night forced march to achieve their position, the 1st Battalion Marines were exhausted and ill-prepared to fend off an all-out assault by the German offensive. Despite this, the Marines were able to hold the position and eventually launch sufficient counterattacks that drove the Germans into entrenched defenses in the Belleau Woods. After several days of intense fighting, the Germans were pushed out of the Belleau Woods with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In the aftermath of these engagements, the Foundation received a request from U.S. High Command requesting assistance in retrieving elements of the 1st Battalion that had gone rogue, and were continuing to engage any forces that entered Belleau Woods, regardless of allegiance. Lieutenant Major Jeremy Stevens, a Foundation field operative embedded with the 1st Battalion, took command of a retrieval operation, which resulted in the deaths of 15 Foundation agents and the acquisition of SCP-5181. SCP-5181 refers collectively to a group of biologically and thaumaturgically enhanced humanoids recovered from the Belleau Wood area north and west of Château-Thierry, France. Originally contained by Foundation assets embedded within the United States 2nd Infantry Division in July 1918. Despite the length of their containment, the 3 surviving members of the SCP-5181 group have shown no signs of advanced age. While testing on the matter has proven inconclusive, it is believed that the 5,181 entities are all biologically immortal, and have shown no degeneration in their physical and cognitive capabilities. 5,181 entities all display significantly enhanced physical characteristics, each showcasing dexterity, endurance, and physical strength far superior to that of a baseline human. Additionally, each subject presents with advanced cases of terminal hypertrichosis 1 as well as multiple musculoskeletal abnormalities. While a majority of these abnormalities are subcutaneous and not readily apparent, all of the 5,181 entities exhibit extensive reformations of the skull and facial structures. SCP-5181-1, -2, and -3 are contained in individual Class A humanoid containment chambers in the secure containment block at Site-12. Each chamber has been modified to allow for a continuous audio-visual feed of the other 2 chambers. At no point should this feed be interrupted, nor should the 5,181 entities be prevented from viewing it at any time. The 5,181 entities are restricted to a vegetarian diet. At no point are they to be supplied with any dietary supplements that are not included on Meal Plan V102. Testing on SCP-5181 has been permanently suspended. Inquiries and proposed testing procedures are to be submitted in writing to the Site-12 Ethics Committee representative. Due to the complexity of operations during recovery of SCP-5181, attempts to completely remove references to the 5,181 entities had mixed results. While the propaganda and disinformation campaigns in Europe were largely successful, references to SCP-5181 in the US media and common knowledge were already so widespread that complete removal of such were deemed detrimental to overall Foundation operations and were ultimately discarded. In lieu of complete erasure, the attempts to spread the Teufelshunde or Devil Dogs moniker across the entirety of the U.S. Marine Corps has seen significant success, while references to the 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Cheyenne Company have largely been eradicated. We then find an addendum from the Ethics Committee regarding SCP-5181. From Dr. Marie Gilbert, of the Ethics Committee. To Dr. Guillaume Ribière, Site 12 Director. May 18, 1940. Re. SCP-5181. I want to make myself very clear. You had no right, morally or legally, to activate SCP-5181. Doing so not only cost the lives of 4 of the SCP-5181 entities, but those of your containment staff, 14 of Site 12 security personnel, and an unknown number of civilians. This is precisely why we don't get involved with the political affairs of mundane governments. I realize that you were acting out of an interest to preserve lives, but these men are no longer soldiers and you have no business putting them into the field. Your rash and inexcusable actions caused infinitely more harm than good, and your beloved France will ultimately have to pay for your actions. SCP-5181 cannot be controlled, and your attempts to do so has cost the lives of men under your command. This is exactly what Order 187 was meant to prevent. I expect your resignation within the hour. Dr. Marie Gilbert, Director, Ethics Committee. Last addendum was the Journal of Lieutenant Richards during the events regarding SCP-5181. It reads: June 2, 1918. We marched through the night, but managed to get here just in time. The French ran away, but the doc says that we're right where we should be. The captain asked him if we were going to finish taking the injections, but Doc said to wait. Once we do, there won't be any turning back. So we wait. Along with the rest of the 1-5. June 4, 1918. We kicked the shit out of them Kraut bastards. We had just enough time to dig little half-graves in the dirt before they started pouring over the hill and into our enfilade. We waited, then we killed. The sound of all those guns going off still rings in my ears. Almost enough to drown out the screaming. It's quiet now, but that isn't gonna last. The captain says. June 6, 1918. This morning we assaulted 142 and finally took it, but a lot of good men won't be going home. The captain and Doc got into it, and the Doc agreed to let us finish. We're being shifted to help 3-6 take Belleau, and the captain says now is the time. Doc gave us all syringes filled with blood and told us to inject ourselves after we move in with 3-6. The others don't quite know what to make of it, but we're goddamn war dogs. Whatever comes, we got this. June 7, 1918. My whole body feels like it's on fire. The pain is spiking through everything, but I ain't ever felt so alive. I can hear everything. I can taste the sweat and rust from the krauts on the breeze blowing through Belleau. I can feel the beating hearts of my brothers and the hair on my arms. I feel strong, stronger than ever I've been. The weariness of sleep is gone, but the hunger remains. I can taste it in my mouth, and I can see it running in their veins. I must. June 10, 1918. We've killed and killed and killed, and the hunger still drives me. War dogs. We're not war dogs anymore. The krauts are calling us Teufelshunde now. Devil dogs. The pride in that is almost enough for me to forget the hunger. Almost enough for me to forget the fear in the eyes of the other Marines. Almost. June 11, 1918. They're not afraid. They're jealous. Jealous of what we've become. Jealous of what we can do. We've taken the woods. They belong to us now, and no one's gonna take them from us. No one's gonna take anything from us ever again. In Memoria Adytum. Of Saarn and Jade tongues. The spray of seawater lashed and whipped at the solitary cowled figure standing atop the cliffs of Naxos, impassively gazing out on the broken vessels that now burned amidst the harbor of the walled city. Their face was hidden, both by a grey cowl of heavy wool and by the tongues of green flame that licked across the armada. Great gouts of jade jumped from ship to ship like a mad beast running its own tongue along its teeth after a grisly meal. Without turning, the figure spoke. How many ships did they lose? Their attendant turned to face the cowled figure, his armor clattering loudly as he did. He was dressed in roughly hewn scales of hammered bronze, decorated in a thin filigree of inlaid copper. Some 30 transports all, my lady. See how they perish from the hubris of their own foul weaponry. Weaponry that we turned against them, thought Clavigar Saarn, her green eyes burning bright as the Mekhanite fleet. Some time earlier. The sun was vicious during the daylight, and so Saarn had adopted the customs of the local populace, wearing robes of silk and shifts of linen, depending upon the particular demands of the occasion. She had even adopted their faces and skin tone, twisting her own flesh into that of a Greek. At present, she found herself wearing a rather fetching robe woven from red silk and golden samite. An iron brooch fashioned into the shape of a nesting viper pinned the fabrics together. Beneath all that clothing, a pair of blades were concealed against the shadow of her body. The city of Naxos was impressively foreboding. It had two entrances, the Gate of Naxos and the Sea Gate. The first of these, the Gate, was constructed from colossal portcullises of crossed iron, and was reputedly impenetrable. Though apparently, reputation alone had not been sufficient to ward off attempts to breach it by wayward nations and jealous rivals. All attempts thus far had been repulsed by the infamous legions of Naxos. These legions consisted of free-born men and women taken from their families at birth as tribute to the city itself. They were raised to know no fear, to submit to no tyrant, and held no loyalty other than to the city and her people. It was little wonder then that they were affectionately named the children of Naxos by the citizens. At the southern side of the city, opposite the Gate of Naxos, as one ran through the market stalls that lined the central river of the city, lay the Sea Gate. Unlike its sibling, it was protected by far thinner walls and enshrouded several locks. Laying at the mouth of the Aegean Sea, the Sea Gate protected the harbor, which was currently occupied by a grand Mekhanite armada. Naxos had joined the numerous political entities, including the Mekhanites, who opposed the Kalmuktama Empire, her Ozyrmax Empire. Like an arrow in darkness, Saarn slipped through the streets of Naxos and beneath an eavesdrop marking the meeting point between herself and the contact within the city. Saarn smiled to herself as she slipped her hands into the deep pockets of her robe, gently patting the bone handles of her knives, one half still wet with warm blood. It appeared that the gates of Naxos had never considered that someone might simply slide through the iron portcullis, twisting their very body into tendrils of rope-like flesh, and reforming theirself on the other side. And neither, it seemed, had the guard watching on with utter horror. "You are late," came a quiet and effeminate voice lurking around the bend of the wall. "Sister, we are like passing ships in the night. And silence is close at hand, sister," Saarn replied in a whisper. "What would you know?" the voice asked. Saarn recognized that voice, hollow and devoid of any emotion, though she could not entirely place the accent. An echoed, dying remnant of one of the myriad cults that had fallen before Adytum, perhaps. "I would know your face before you vanish into the nest of vipers. I could use allies tonight." "Very well," the voice responded as a pale woman rounded the corner. She wore a heavy gray linen dress with a black cape flowing out behind it. The entire ensemble was lined with golden thread, which adorned the hems of the dress. Her face was concealed beneath a black hood, though Saarn could make out a red welt across the left of the woman's jaw. Attiring yourself like a follower of the old Black King would be a fatal mistake if one discovered the truth of your mission. Saarn replied after taking careful notice of the slender blade strapped to the woman's hip. Luckily, none have. She smiled, stepping out from under the eavesdrop and into the light as the golden thread of her dress glistened under the sun. I know their words and symbols well. Saarn followed the cloaked figure out into the streets of Naxos, feeling the worn, sun-baked cobbles through the soles of her sandals. The followers of the old Black King belonged to an ancient cult that had been prolific throughout the frozen wastelands of Siberia, until they were condemned as heretics by the Kamaktama and the Davites before them. Their followers were executed in droves, summarily, if they confessed their heresies, and flayed alive if they refused to repent. The Armada moves tonight. This is our final chance to remove that dreaded fire from their hands. We'll stop the Mekhanites here at Naxos, a wondrous victory for the Holocaust. Nobody has to die tonight. I'm aware of that. Have you located their stockpile of sea fire? Saarn asked as they crossed the street and made for the temple of the old Black King. It was a lonely building of blackened stone sticking out like a sore thumb amongst the sandstone buildings which cramped the streets of Naxos. I have. It is beneath the temple of Mekhanite, the woman answered, tapping at the etchings of bronze concealed within the cast iron handle of the door. Alchemical etchings, Saarn guessed, from their shape. Those elemental currents hung heavy about the temple of the old Black King, swirling and dancing about the air, and the door swung open. The cloaked lady entered first, gently closing the door behind Saarn. The temple was entirely empty, unsurprisingly, considering that the entirety of the old Black King's surreptitious worshippers were now dead, or worse. Saarn drew up a chair and sat herself down. Despite being windowless, the room remained illuminated by a dull haze of coalescent light. My real name is Yulia. She drew in a breath and let the elements settle once more, bathing the room in bright light. I do not expect you to share your real name, but I'd feel more comfortable addressing you as something other than sister. It becomes awfully tiring. Saarn nodded. You may call me Jalista. Very well. Jalista, the stockade of sea fire is concealed beneath the temple of Mekhanite, guarded closely by legates faithful and legates primus. No doubt it'll prove difficult to move such dangerous weaponry between just the two of us. Saarn interjected as she gently ran her fingers along the hilt of her knives. Once slick with wet blood, the blade had slaked its thirst, and was now dry as its bone haft. Nonsense. I've already made it much easier for us both. Yulia stood and stamped her foot against the floor of the temple. A loud mechanical clink rang out, and a trapdoor opened behind Yulia. See. Saarn moved from her seat and looked down into the cavernous space beneath the temple. Tunnels? She asked. Dug with the Terranous ethers. They stretch across Naxos, and one of these tunnels so happens to emerge directly beneath a basement concealed within the temple of Mekhanite. When? Saarn asked, her green eyes piercing into the gloom. As soon as you like, Jalista. Saarn dropped into the pit enclosed within the temple of the old Black King, watching as Yulia closed the trapdoor behind the pair. Saarn had changed to better suit her environment, a pair of moleskin riding boots and a crisp leather hauberk. She shunned gloves at all times, preferring to feel the bone handles pressing against her palms. The leather tinning about the smooth bone provided grip, even when they were coated with warm and wet blood. Her knives lusted for blood, drinking it deep, and channeling her flesh crafting through it. Yulia hadn't changed a thing about her attire. Saarn suspected that the dress might have been treated with alchemical properties, or maybe enhanced with arcane wards. She couldn't be sure as the pair padded silently within the crumbling tunnels. The scent of death was all about her, not fresh death, no metallic sense of blood or the pleasant scent of flesh, only the stench of rot and bone. Are we beneath a graveyard, Yulia? Saarn asked as she shifted her paired knives from her belt, sliding the shorter parrying dagger into the scabbard on her legs. We're inside the graveyard. These are the catacombs of old that the ancestors of Naxos would inter their dead within. That custom has become lost to them, hence their obsession with burning the dead, Jalista. I see. Saarn muttered as she kicked the rotting bones of a rat down the channels that ran along either side of the path. The musty and damp smell of mud choking at her lungs, she hurried her way through the compact tunnels of earth. Their obsession with burning the dead. She grinned at that. She would give them a funeral pyre they wouldn't soon forget, something to remember their treachery by. Here, Jalista. Yulia stopped and gestured towards the ceiling. There above our heads. Nodding, Saarn pulled her long knife free from its scabbard of rough-hewn leather and hammered brass, feeling it tug gently against the inner lining. She raised the knife to her mouth and carefully slid the blade between her teeth, biting down hard to trap it still. Yulia stood to one side with her feet planted slightly apart, grasping the slender blade free of its scabbard. Only now did Saarn come to realize that it was her crosius, the tool of the alchemist. Hers was shaped like a double-edged sword with a slender blade constructed from silvered steel, and finished with a pommel of varnished ebony. She raised it aloft, channeling the filaments of the earth into her left hand, sending them rushing into the ceiling as she mixed streaks of darkness into the stream. The streaks of void tore through the stone floor of the basement, devouring the mortar in a deep black roaring with silent echoes. Saarn tossed the rope up into the hole and slowly ascended into the darkness above. In a single fluid motion, she freed her long knife back into her right hand and carefully navigated the darkness, illuminated by an eerie and sickly green glow. All around her were caches of sea fire, the devastating weapon of the Mekhanites. It would stick to clothing, armor, water, even flesh. Clinging desperately, it immolated the victim and burnt them to naught but ashes in minutes, filling the air with the acrid scent of cauterized flesh. A perfect weapon to purge the world of those that worship the flesh. How shall we move these barrels out of this storehouse? Saarn called out to the darkness. Carefully, I suspect, Yulia replied. A faint glow illuminated Saarn's side, revealing Yulia in a mixture of pallid green and bright white light. I can channel the airness ethers to move them into the tunnel, but it will take some time. Saarn nodded. Hoping Yulia had seen her silent reply in the dimly lit room, stealthily padding over to stand by the storeroom door, she reversed the grip on her long knife as she slid the parrying dagger free from her boot. In close quarters, she could open a throat with the dagger quicker than she might stick a pig with the knife. She could hear two voices out on the corridor, both Greek and heavily laden with tongues of wine. I heard the Armada set sail tonight. And I heard that some cunning paid me back for the vases of wine I bought him and his wife out of my own pay. All right, Alexios, what do I owe? 2 whores and a new spearhead would be a St. 2. You don't have 2 cocks, Alexios. But I do have 2 hands and a cock. Beg off, 1 and a new spear. Deal. The voices trailed off as one of the guards stumbled off, his armored scales clanking against one another as he heaved loudly. Jalista! Jalista! Yulia was yelling in a hoarse whisper, a cache of Greek fire dangling precipitously off the cavernous hole in the basement floor. Sprinting at pace, Saarn helped steady the copper drum while Yulia channeled the airness ethers once more and balanced the drum back to center. With a violent clang, the door to the basement was swung open by the helmeted guard who slowly made his way into the room, lowering his spear and waving it about in front of him. His spear tip, bronze armor, and youthful face illuminated in the sickly glow of jade. Yulia and Saarn split to opposite sides of the rooms. Gesturing with her knife, Saarn sidled forwards against the wall as Yulia jumped into the hole, the sound of her fall buffered by a cushion of air. Slipping behind the guard, Saarn attempted to slide the long knife between his neck guard and helmet. It ripped against the chain mail beneath and rings of metal erupted along her blade. Flesh and blood tore free from the gaping wound that she created in his neck. The guard spun, catching Saarn in the thigh and slashing ribbons from her hauberk. The spear point had torn away at the flesh beneath. but she quickly crafted the flesh before her wound began to bleed. She caught the force of his blow with her parrying dagger and turned it down, reversing the spear point into the ground, and driving her knee into his stomach. Winded, the guard clutched at his chest and dropped his spear, making for the sword strapped at his side. The mistake of youth, Saarn thought, as she slashed the long knife into the gap at his neck once more, feeling the chain of glistening rubies slide free from his throat. The young man collapsed to the floor, his free hand clutching at his throat as his dominant hand tightened about the hilt of his sword. Saarn placed both knives into their sheaths at her hip. Stepping carefully over the body, she shut the door to the basement and descended the rope, catching one final glimpse at the young Mekhanite guard drowning in his own blood. Yulia and Saarn stood alone in the temple of the old Black King. Saarn was idly cleaning her long knife with an oiled cloth as Yulia examined the 15 caches of Greek fire that now stood as menhirs in the Black King's hall. The hall was a simple place, barren and devoid of any connection to emotion. Hanging above the dais was a simple painting, displaying 2 masked women impaling snakes with swords. They were accompanied by a figure shrouded in darkness, with a golden crown perching on his brow. Beneath the 3 large figures were a group of humans, offering cupped hands towards the old Black King and his 2 attendants. The old Black King had been a harsh figure, his reign swiftly ended by the diva. Do we have allies within the city? People we can deliver these weapons to? Yulia asked, etching yet more alchemical symbols into the surface of the caches. Bonding seals to prevent the volatile sea fire from detonating. She thinks we're just neutralizing these weapons, Saarn thought. Outside of the city. I plan to smuggle them out now in a wagon driven by one of our men. Will you come with us? I don't plan to spend another night in this wretched city. Yulia turned in her seat. Saarn noticed that she still concealed her face within the hood of her cloak. What do you plan to do with these? Only Clarali Alka knows. I haven't been informed of his plans, have you? Saarn asked, cautiously probing Yulia's information. No, I hope he won't use them. We'd be no better than. A loud knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Yulia opened the door as a burly, armored man barged into the room, kneeling down before Saarn. My lady, the wagon is ready. With a nod, Saarn rose to her feet and made her way over to the wagon, leaving Yulia and her attendant, Clarali Alka, to fill the wagon themselves. Leaving the city had been easy, a simple ride down the central avenue that marked the market street of Naxos, and then presenting their forged documents to the legionnaire that manned the gates. Inspections were completely avoided by Yulia's use of alchemy and Saarn's glamour upon the caches of sea fire, which had disguised them as simple vases of olive oil. Alka had taken the caches of sea fire and given them over to the faithful, those deemed true adherents of Nalka. Even now, she could see the robed servants, disguised as Mekhanites through use of carnomancy, boarding the myriad vessels of the armada. Drawing her cowl tight about her face, Saarn watched as Alka strode towards her, his decorated armor glinting beneath the pale moonlight. He walked right up to her and kneeled before her, the horsehair of his great helm writhing in the wind. It is done, my lady. Saarn said nothing as she glanced to her left. Yulia had not moved since the faithful had begun to board the Mekhanite armada. Her fist was clenched tight around the hilt of her crosius, and her hood disguised the emotion twisting across her face. Yulia. There is nothing more to say between us, Jalista, Yulia said softly, her heavy cape flowing behind her in the cool and crisp breeze of night. Saarn's shoulders tightened, her muscles drawing taut as she watched the amassed armada with gritted teeth. The Mekhanite fleet was impressive, hulking transports, each one crewed by hundreds of legates, war galleys and dramas with battering rams of brass and hammered bronze, and the behemoth gigantes which bore the colossi, the armored war machines of the Mekhanite civilization. And then, from out of the gloom, came a sailing merchant ship, carrying itself into the harbor of Naxos upon rotted wood. The ship meandered its way along the harbor, and all around it, the Mekhanite armada began to split away, veering off their courses to avoid the stray ship. In a flash of jade light, that little merchant ship and the entire Mekhanite fleet disappeared behind the glow. Seconds later, Saarn felt warm air rush over her skin and tasted burning flesh on her tongue. Writhing tongues of emerald flames whipped and wreathed across the harbor. Splintered fragments of burnt wood were cast through the air and rained back down into the sea. The entire Mekhanite fleet had been consumed in that conflagration. No man could have survived. Saarn grimaced. Yulia's hood had been knocked from her face, and for the first time, Saarn could see her cold, gray eyes burning with fury, reflections of serpentine flames writhing within those eyes. I watched my people be burned alive by the diva. They'd flay them first, peeling the skin away, inch by inch, to expose the naked flesh beneath. Then they'd stake them through the feet, covering the whole body in pitch, and let the flames lick at the exposed flesh. The diva considered that a mercy. They called the victims of their torture the lucky ones. When I was a young girl, a diva matriarch came from my family. We worshipped the old Black King, the very same king they'd flayed and burnt, for the crime of rejecting the diva. I watched my mother and father die in agony. Before they could do the same to me, a robed man saved my life. I never asked his name, he simply told me that we were free. When I returned to the village, they told me that Ion had delivered them from evil. They repeated the robed man's words, "We are free." Yulia's fist was trembling as her fingers tightened around her crocus, the veins in her wrist throbbing. I was there at Adytum. I listened to Ion preach his heart out to the hawkos that crowded and braying herd of sheep. I believed that Ion was better than the diva. He knew what it was like to suffer. His sermons were filled with grief. He was a wretch, just the same as me. That innocent little girl looked upon him with doe eyes and doted upon him. She turned toward Saarn, the burned flesh of her lower jaw twisting her face into a snarl of agony. "You have killed that girl today, Saarn." Saarn felt her heart twist as Yulia walked into the shadow of Naxos, her golden-hemmed cloak casting long shadows amidst tongues of jade. Hi, welcome to Cosmic and Body Horror. In this channel we discuss content related to Lovecraft horror, Cthulhu mythos and body horror. I upload videos on a daily basis, so before we get started, if I could ask you for a thumbs up at some point during this video if you enjoyed the content, please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks for your support. Of the Crimeless Traitors. We first find a translation notice by Dr. Judith Lowe, Senior Advisor at the Department of History, Religious Group of Interest Threat Analysis. It reads, originally written in an ancient dialect of the Amoranga language, the excerpt provided above is a translation of a part of a previously unknown, larger body of poems of anonymous hand, detailing the events of the War of the Flesh from the perspective of war victims and prisoners. Despite other Sarkic pieces of literature and tales appearing worldwide, we have found, so far, no evidence of a similar collection existing anywhere else. Reasons for this lack of existence, whether intentional by any parties or not, remain unknown. The poem then reads: 1. In times of old, an age long past, the world was into conflict cast. The war of flesh, as it's now known. On its sides, factions two alone. In one camp, titans tall as sky. Their burning answers to deny. Heretic calls the world then held. One leader to his men compelled. Their enemies, those brave with will. Once slaves with fearless faith instilled. that rose from shackles led by one, and 4 saints that were ruled by none. In chaos, one can hardly find a man that truly kept their mind. But one of Gyaros found his chance. By skill alone he held his stance. Though sealed in cells as dark as night, he got to live a newfound right. 2. The man was young, and skilled like few. His voice a rule, his magic true. His warden, rare and pure of soul. Through day and night she would patrol his cell and watch the man within. Her metal frame bereft of skin. Metal plates and gears formed her bones. She'd guard the man in flesh-like robes. They eyed each other through and through, and over time each of their crews. Orders so questioned in the night. How can this be so just and right? For the two were merely recruits, by the war itself made half-brutes. So to oppose what they were told was in their nature brave and bold. When passing time made neither free, the man said, "Run away with me." 3. She raised a brow, was this a plot? But took the hand of who she caught, and with slight fear went where she'd please, to embrace the Nalcan breeze. It was a shock to see so close the men that anger past provoke, and though they varied widely still, they were not men that she could kill. The men within were young and old, and Una like all she'd been told. In godlessness they lay unbound, in rule of will they beauty found. She turned towards her new-made friend, and, forcing her worldview to bend, she offered him the gift of choice, for him to listen to her voice. And so, shrouded in careful trust, he left home to embrace her rust. 4. On far horizon he then found a fortress with coherence bound, where men and women like gears turned. In this dance of their god they learned, where reason always reigned supreme. They had no king and had no queen, just laws of God they need abide, as taught by prophets in loud pride. The young man gasped, for what he saw was nothing like he'd known as law. He'd always thought young they did kill, yet they had merely wills of steel, that so in knowledge widely grew, and made of chaos logic do. He saw so much he never dreamt, shocked to his heart a message sent. But time was up, that they both knew. They headed back with new taboos. 5. Next months pretending they both spend, as if no such event occurred. But after many sleepless nights, the Nalca said, "This is not right. I can no longer like this do, and therefore I must ask, can you?" She closed her eyes, and focused deep. I hear them every night in sleep. They're beast-like screams, kids thrown as bait. I think, I want to meet this fate. The answer's no, and break the wheel. We just must for once and real. He moved his head with hope in eyes, his soul and words just simply wise. Then let's together out there go, to tell the world of what we know. And so, though the two made no crime, they were now traitors of their time. 6. They went away so far and wide, but never once did they decide to turn their way back to their homes, even though they gave up their thrones. In alone time shared love they found, with no one but themselves around. In years alive they old did grow, still remembering years ago. But the world them remembered too, and warlords knew exactly who ran away in the past long gone, and in anger forth their swords drawn. They tried to run, they tried to hide. No one could understand their side. In mutual unbroken care, they still were for each other there. And even when darkness them took, not once did they regret their book. 7. But ages pass, and so do lives, and their love too abides, said rights. Hence millennia later too, none of the lovers still ensue. They both fought well, they both fought brave. But nature takes what it once gave. Pierced by flesh swords and vibrant spears, they faded into empty tears. So thanks to hate and thanks to time, the everlasting lay divine in crypts below an unchanged world, in loving arms so gently curled. No sound to hear, no light to see, a promise empty to be free, fulfilled in death and nothing more. As cogs and flesh waged final war, and there they lay, within the deep, until Ion wakes again from sleep.